simpler form. For example, you could develop a super complicated fighting game full of combos and parries, but if any player can achieve a fairly high win rate by just mindlessly mashing a single button, then button mashing is a degenerate strategy because when it's used, it simplifies an otherwise non reducible game. So, thank you for coming to my TED Talk on degeneracy in game design. It's a very interesting topic, one I intend to publish a full video on at some point. I really wanted to get this term out there because it's very useful when talking about MMO design and talking about RuneScape in particular. So, let's get back to MMOs. In MMOs, character classes are progress degenerate. That is, of course, they're all special snowflakes with different features and qualities from one another. But when it comes to progression through to the end game, they are all basically the same. Even in a game like Final Fantasy XIV, where you can freely change your job, you never need to switch jobs to progress through to the bulk of the game's content. At the end of the day, a warrior and a ninja play pretty differently, but playing as either class gets you to the same place. 14 never says, in order to fight the next boss, you need to have leveled the Black Mage and the Paladin and the White Mage jobs to level 52. You have to have mining at least level 60, and you have to be a level 40 goldsmith. And oh boy, RuneScape does exactly that. And that's why RuneScape is not an MMO. Part 2, quest design. Or RuneScape has obtuse, difficult, 5-hour long quests that require 600 plus hours of play to even attempt, and oh my god, I want more of them. So I'd said that attention calibration is RuneScape's biggest strength, but the quest design is nearly tied for me. The quests in RuneScape are unlike anything you're going to see in a modern MMO. World of Warcraft has been around for such a long time now that most people have forgotten what it changed about the genre, and for many people, WoW is the old MMO. The biggest innovation that WoW brought to the genre was its overhaul of quest design. Instead of being complicated and obtuse like Ultima and EverQuest, WoW quests were simple and easy to understand. To explain how RuneScape deviates from WoW, we really need to recap some history here. So let's just go through a list of WoW's quest design innovations. Number 1, quests should be relatively short and of relatively uniform length. Number 2, quests should deal with content in the immediate vicinity of the quest giver. Number 3, quests should ask the player to complete a simple task or minigame with an easy to understand objective. Number 4, quests should be able to be completed entirely on site with temporary materials found on site. Players shouldn't need to bring gear or items from outside the quest area. Number 5, quests should have very simple prerequisites, usually just character level and maybe a couple other quests as part of an in-zone quest chain. Number 6, quests should be episodic. Outside of in-zone quest chains, players should be able to complete quests in any zone in any order without missing out on the story. Number 7, quests should be very sight-readable. You should be able to use map markers and navigational tools. It shouldn't be possible for you to get stuck or lost doing a quest. Number 8, quests should provide great gear and XP rewards and should be the optimal route to play through the game instead of grinding, as was favored by the MMOs that WoW replaced. However, quest rewards should be degenerate. If there are 2 quests in a zone, they should provide about the same rewards per hour. Number 9, despite all of this, quests should never be mandatory for progress to the game. When new content is added, old quests can generally be ignored. Now, my objective with this essay is not to shit on WoW and Final Fantasy XIV. I think those games are very good. I used to play the old school 90s and early aughts MMOs that WoW replaced, and they were rough. The innovations that Blizzard brought to the table changed the landscape forever, and all of those choices appeared to be unequivocally good at the time. So there's this really important idea that I think we all need to understand about game design, and I'm going to repeat this in every section coming up. It is extremely rare for a game design decision to be a strict upgrade with no downside whatsoever. Design decisions are trade-offs or side grades. When something is gained, something else is necessarily lost. Game designers are forced to decide whether the trade-offs are worth it, and often with imperfect information. Sometimes the upside is so awesome that the feeling that something has been lost takes months or years for players and critics to detect. Cover-based shooters with regenerating health seem to be the correct way to do shooters until Doom 2016 came around, almost a decade later, to demonstrate what we were missing. Another example of trade offs, I think a lot of people can understand the double edged sword that is fast travel. Fast travel was this brilliant idea. Man, isn't it annoying that we have to keep walking over the map? It's so boring and repetitive. Let's just let the player pop open the map and teleport wherever they want to go. But I think if you've ever played a game that doesn't have fast travel or which gates fast travel until very late in the game, you know that you lose something in the process when there is fast travel. It's good, it's nice, but I had the entire map of Dark Souls 1 just burned into my brain because I had to run through it so many times. Whereas in every other Soulsborne game, fast travel is available right away, and I don't know those maps at all. I bring this up because I want you to take these lessons we've learned about fast travel and apply them to everything, everything in game design. But here, let's apply it to quest design. Apply it to that list of 9 things and go, wow, that just looks like a list of 9 good things. If I were to invert all of those things, that sounds bad, right? But try to imagine what could be wrong, what we could be losing in the process. WoW's quest innovation has blossomed over the decades, and virtually all modern MMOs and even MMO adjacent games have adopted it. Quests should be short, simple, parsable, relevant, difficult to get stuck on. You shouldn't need a walkthrough to find out what to do. You shouldn't have to do too much thinking. It sounds great, but in the process, I would argue we have left some things behind, and I'm going to try to explain by talking how RuneScape handles quests in comparison to WoW. Back to the list. Do these apply to RuneScape quests? Okay, number 1, quests should be relatively short and a relatively uniform length. Nope. RuneScape quests vary in length from 5 minutes long to over 5 hours. Those 5-hour quests are awesome. Like, if I could just give money to Jagex to just keep making 5-hour quests. Sorry, I'm gushing. Next point. Number 2, quests should deal with content in the immediate vicinity of the quest giver. Nope. RuneScape quests involve the player globetrotting all across the game world. Maybe number 3. Okay, quests should ask the player to complete a simple task or mini game with an easy to understand objective. I would say no. RuneScape quests almost never involve trivial tasks like kill 20 boars or collect 2 bear asses. Quest mini games are unique, they're rarely repeated. Understanding what to do next is often not simple. I mean, hints exist, but there's never an on screen guide that says, combine the 3 items in your inventory, or use a bottle on the water spout, or cast a fire spell on the target. Just a few quick examples. In one quest, you have to use a bowl on a water pump to get a bowl of water. Now, the bowl is an item in your inventory. It's not. As I'm describing this quest, I can imagine how WoW would adapt the quest, where there's just like a shiny thing that you go up to the water pump and it just automatically gives you a bowl of water. But in RuneScape, you have a bowl in your inventory and you have to click use on it and then use bowl on pump, right? Okay. Then you have to equip a pair of gloves. Fingerless gloves won't work. Any gloves in the game will work as long as they're not fingerless. And then pick some nettles. You have to use the nettles on your bowl of water and then light a fire by using a tinderbox and logs, and then use the bowl on the fire before it burns out. Another quest requires you to drop an optional pet called a pet rock into a geyser. Then you need to fish for it, but you have to have a special pair of quest gloves you got from an unrelated earlier quest to keep it from burning your hands when you fish it up. And then a third quest involves a puzzle that requires you to cast a specific spell on a door that is typically only used when leveling crafting. So it's bizarre that you're casting this spell on something other than an orb in your inventory. Again, reading all that, I can imagine how WoW would adapt that so that you're doing the exact same tasks I just described, but it would all be automated. Like, imagine that it's more like a text adventure where you practically have to type out use rock on geyser, right? That's how RuneScape feels. Okay, number 4. Quests should be able to be completed entirely on site with temporary materials found on site. Players should not need to bring gear or items from outside the quest area. That is a big no. RuneScape quests often have a laundry list of items that you need to complete them, and they need to be purchased or crafted before the quest even begins. Remember that one about the gloves that need to be close-fingered? Like, in WoW, there might be like a temporary shiny thing on a table that says equip the gloves, but here they're talking about any gloves in the game. And since you have to bring in all these items from outside the quest to complete them, sometimes that gates which players can even attempt the quest in the first place, if they don't have trivial access to that item yet. So, for example, the quest on the screen requires magic logs to complete. Magic logs require a really high woodcutting level to access, so if you can't trade for them, it's going to be tough to get them. Alrighty, number 5, quests should have simple prerequisites, usually just character level, potentially other quests in part of a quest chain. So this is a gigantic 72-point font no. RuneScape quest prerequisites are extremely complex. Most quests not only require a variety of skills to be at specific levels, they also require a specific subset of other quests to be completed, which themselves have their own independent sets of prerequisites. I can already see people's faces. It sounds terrible, right? But I disagree. I think it's awesome. And to explain why, we're going to have to get into self direction, which is the next section. So bear with me. Alrighty, number 6, quests should be episodic. Outside of in-zone quest chains, players should be able to complete quests in any zone, in any order, without missing out on part of the story. And this is the first one that's kind of true in RuneScape. RuneScape quests are episodic in the sense that the player can approach them in many different orders, choosing to start with the quests that they already qualify for. But as we just discussed, the prerequisites can be very complex. Since you're required to complete lots of other quests to see new ones, storylines are picking up where they left off in the previous prerequisite quests, and you're constantly running into familiar faces. For example, the infamous RuneScape Recipe for Disaster Uber quest requires you to do 38 otherwise unrelated quests to be completed or even attempted, and it features characters, storylines, and follow-up from all of those prerequisite quests. Before we hit the next bullet, I should say that I was shopping the draft of this essay around to non-RuneScape players, and they got really confused in this section. Because what I'm talking about, it sounds like it exists in World of Warcraft, and I kind of need to explain what the difference is. So this is a quest chain from World of Warcraft. It's the starting quest line for Death Knights. It's about 36 quests long, it spans a few zones, and it takes about an hour and a half to complete. In Final Fantasy XIV, a comparable quest chain might be all of the main story quest steps for a single zone. This set of Final Fantasy XIV quests will have you tour an entire zone, do a dungeon, and it ends with a boss fight. It probably takes 3 or 4 hours to complete from start to finish. So I've learned that the World of Warcraft way of doing quests is so burned into people's brains. Like the word quest, as it applies to game design, is so standardized now that people weren't really understanding that what I'm describing as a single quest in RuneScape maps more closely to an entire quest chain in a game like WoW or Final Fantasy XIV. Check out the length of this walkthrough for Dragon Slayer 2, which is an endgame RuneScape quest. The walkthrough is 2 hours long. I explained all this to a friend, and he said, okay, so RuneScape uses the word quest in like the Tolkien sense, like the Lord of the Rings sense, as in the quest is throw the ring in Mount Doom, and the content of the quest is the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. And that's an amazing analogy. That's absolutely what I'm trying to say here. We're so used to that game design meaning of the word quest that was popularized by World of Warcraft, we've forgotten that it basically just means task now in game design language. If you ported the Lord of the Rings into Final Fantasy XIV, you wouldn't have one giant throw the ring in Mount Doom quest. You would have quest chains with tasks like solve the riddle of the door, that would be a quest. Read the Book of Balin, that would be a quest. Escape the Balrog, and so on. Alrighty, so number 7, quests should be very sight readable. Using map markers and navigational tools, it shouldn't really be possible for the player to get stuck doing a quest. I'm sure all the RuneScape veterans watching right now are kind of going, ugh. I don't know about that one. So RuneScape quests can be sight read, but doing so is far from trivial. There are no map markers. There are no navigational tools to keep you from getting lost. Older quests often require getting external help, either by asking other players or doing some pointed Google searching. Quests are deliberately obtuse in the way that Dark Souls quests can be obtuse. Often it's not clear where to go next. Sometimes you just have to stumble onto the next step. And number 8, quests should provide great gear and XP rewards and should be the optimal route to play through the game instead of grinding, as was favored by the MMOs that WoW replaced. However, quest rewards should be degenerate. If there are 2 quests in a zone, they should both provide about the same rewards per hour. So RuneScape quests do provide excellent XP, but with the way the rest of the game is organized, there are a finite number of quests in the game, and they all provide a finite amount of skill XP. And RuneScape quest rewards are the opposite of degenerate. The 139 some quests in RuneScape at time of recording all provide wildly different rewards. Some of the shorter quests just give you a small amount of money and XP. Other quests might gate huge areas of the game, unlock access to bosses or raids, or otherwise block access to huge swaths of content. Quests rarely give rewards that the player could get elsewhere. If a quest gives you access to a new sword, then that quest is often the only source of that sword in the game. The Dragon Scimitar, for example, is a reward for completing a quest, but it does drop from some enemies. You can find it elsewhere. But even if you get it elsewhere, if you get it from a drop or you buy it from a player, you can't equip it until you complete that quest. I teased the self-direction section earlier. I'm going to tease it again here. These non-degenerate rewards really make RuneScape work. Finally, number 9, despite all of this, quests should never be mandatory for fundamental progress through the game, and when new content is added, old quests can generally be ignored. So, RuneScape quests are absolutely mandatory for progressing through the game, as they gate the majority of the game's content. Final Fantasy XIV has a similar approach. In FF14, a single Uber quest chain called the Main Story Quest, or MSQ, is required to unlock all of that game's content. RuneScape doesn't have an MSQ. Instead, the player just eventually wants to complete all of the quests in the game in order to access all of its content. Even the little dinky short quests from closer to the game's launch, which might seem inconsequential to the player at first, like there's one that takes 5 minutes where you have to bake a cake. Even those little dinky quests end up being prerequisites for the massive 5+ hour Grandmaster quests at the end game. There's more to unpack here. It could fill its own separate video. I haven't even gotten into the way that quests are individually authored by team members at Jagex. They aren't required to fit into any quest design formula like you see in most WoW or FF14 quests. And as a result, each quest feels like an individual labor of love, like something you'd get from a dungeon master in a tabletop RPG. I gotta stop gushing, or this 3-hour video is going to be a 10-hour video. Suffice to say, the best way to play RuneScape is to play all of it. New quests don't invalidate the old ones. Instead, they often require you to complete the old ones first. So speaking of having all of this relevant, non-degenerate content to do, that's a big part of why RuneScape is not an MMO. Part 3, self-direction. Or, ooh, a piece of candy. So I really encourage you to check out Dan Olson's video, World of Warcraft Classic and What We Left Behind. He does a great job explaining why WoW Classic is appealing to modern players. And one of his focuses has to do with self-direction. Dan says in the video, Classic has an unexpected strength. If there's nothing to do, if nothing is meaningful, then you are free to self-direct. Dan's argument is that modern WoW gives you dozens of officially sanctioned ways to play. You log in, you do your world quests, you run your dungeons, you join your raids, and so on. There's so much to do and so many signposts screaming at the player, hey, do this. And having so many options can just paralyze the player. Instead of feeling like you can do anything, you feel like you must do these sanctioned things, and it can make the game feel smaller. In contrast, in WoW Classic, there's basically nothing to do. There are few formal systems beckoning you to interact with them. It's a pretty simple grind to level cap, and once you reach the end game, there's not much content left to explore, at least not compared to modern WoW. And the content that is there isn't conventionally challenging, at least not compared to modern WoW's endgame. Rather, it's time consuming. But because you're not being asked to do anything, and the game isn't telling you, hey, here's a handful of 7 efficient ways to play, you're just free to do whatever you want. So let's picture modern WoW with a self-direction bar to represent how much self-direction is in the game. And let's use one of those segmented Kingdom Hearts bars where each extra segment up there represents an entire additional bar. Let's compare that to WoW Classic and add WoW Classic's self-direction bar. I think this is a fair summary. I'm obviously making this up, but my argument is that WoW Classic is pretty strongly self-directed compared to modern WoW. And this bar thing is obviously driving to a point. RuneScape has WoW Classic self-direction, but on steroids. In WoW Classic, there's nothing to do, but in RuneScape, there's everything to do. To see all of the content, You have to level up all 23 skills as high as possible. You have to do every single quest. You need to complete all of the achievements. But hey, wait a minute. Doesn't that just sound like modern WoW? Isn't that signposting problem where you're getting option paralysis from having too much to do? Well, WoW gives you 100 things to do, and it says any of these will progress your account. But that progress is degenerate. You can represent an hour of dungeoning as being equal to a couple hours of questing, or back in Battle for Azeroth, doing your weekly Warfront lockout was about equal to doing a difficult mythic dungeon. Blizzard wants to say, hey, here's a dozen options. Pick one because all roads lead to the same destination. Final Fantasy XIV is different. It's often called a theme park MMO. You have the one main story quest, which is a visual novel punctuated by tightly designed instanced content, but the devs are constantly adding little mini games, side quests, and optional bosses along the way. Those side roads don't lead to the same end like they do in WoW. Playing Triple Triad or Lord of Verminion or running old optional raids doesn't really get you to the end game any faster. Instead of giving you dozens of roads to the same destination, there is one road to one destination and dozens of optional little distractions that you unlock along the way. So WoW has many roads, one destination. FF14 has one road, one destination. Which of those two does RuneScape pick? It's neither. In RuneScape, all of the content is needed to progress. It's not dozens of roads to the same destination, it's dozens of roads, and you must eventually travel down all of them. You've probably seen this sort of structure before in a different genre. Metroidvanias. Yeah, I'm making that argument. I am going to argue that RuneScape is structured like a Metroidvania. Strap in, let's go. So another great YouTube channel, Mark Brown at Game Maker's Toolkit has a great video series called Boss Keys, and it talks about dungeon design in Zelda and in Metroidvanias. It's wonderful. I've linked it in the description. You should totally watch it. He comes up with this unique level design dependency chart that shows the different keys and locks required for progression in these games. You can think of a key as a progression gating ability like a double jump or a bomb that opens a lock, which is an obstacle to progress like a high ledge or a bombable wall. RuneScape is structured like a Metroidvania dependency chart. There are hundreds of unique progression locks, which can only be opened with hundreds of unique progression keys. And the keys and locks take the form of quest, skill level, or gear prerequisites that gate access to content. As a player, you can pick any one of hundreds of different content paths, and all of them are going to lead to gaining progression keys that you need to unlock content elsewhere. And you might be wondering, but in modern MMOs, there are also level, quest, and gear requirements that gate content. How is that different? It comes down to structure. As we've discussed, in a typical MMO, you have one character level that represents your combat ability. You have simple quest chains that can be followed one after the other, and gear is a huge topic. I'm going to get into it later, but to summarize, in a typical MMO, gear is extremely degenerate. Your gear power is just something you estimate with an item level. In RuneScape, individual pieces of gear are required for individual pieces of content, so there's not a way to summarize your equipment with an eye level path. You can't just look at a set of gear and say, that's better than this set of gear. It depends on what you're using it for. More on that later. Okay. It would be an impossibly daunting task to try to make a Game Maker's Toolkit dependency chart for RuneScape. But I'm going to try to make a simplified version of it to just visually demonstrate the difference between WoW, Final Fantasy XIV, and RuneScape's progression design. So GMTK introduces the idea of games being thought of as wide, tall, or both. A wide part of the game means you have a lot of options to progress at the same time. If we look at this small piece of his Super Metroid chart, the game widens up after you get the Morph Ball, with more paths being available to explore. Conversely, a tall part of the game is where you have to do multiple things in a specific sequence. It's linear. One task gates another, one after the other. And there's nothing in this section of the chart that's particularly tall, but notice how you have to get the high jump to jump to where Kraid is, and then you have to fight Kraid before you can get the Varia suit. Wide and tall are not quality descriptors. Wide games are not necessarily better than tall games. They are different, and let's bring this up again. Each one has benefits and drawbacks, and games can have both long, strictly linear sections mixed up with wide open exploration. So let's take a look at the dependency charts for modern MMOs. I'm going to be looking at this zoomed all the way out. Obviously, there's some dependency within a quest chain, for example, but I want to show you the general shape of these games to contrast them with RuneScape. Let's do WoW first. This is how I would chart WoW's high level structure. Here I've made each node one of the game's expansions, along with the option of grinding dungeons and using the free level cap boost that comes with a new character. The purple node in the center is the newest expansion, Shadowlands. And in Shadowlands, they've overhauled the leveling experience so that you pick just one of these expansion and use it to level to the end game. So you can think of WoW as a very wide game, but not a tall game. That is, they've tried to structure the game so that you have many options, but they all get you to the same content. And to me, that structure is fractal. If we were to dive into a random expansion here, say Burning Crusade, it's the same basic shape. Now we're in Burning Crusade. We can move through the individual Burning Crusade zones in whatever order we like. You'll notice that now we do have to do all of the zones eventually to get to Shadowlands, but the point remains that it's wide and not tall. And how about FF14? So instead of being wide, Final Fantasy XIV is tall. Each main story quest requires the previous quest in the chain to be completed and is a prerequisite for the next step. The way you reach the end game is to finish this Uber quest chain. And as I mentioned earlier, there are optional offshoots that unlock along the way, but I would still describe Final Fantasy XIV as a game that is tall rather than wide. And now it's time to show you RuneScape. For WoW and FF14, I talked about the big picture structure, but I can't really get away with that in RuneScape because if I did, it would be a multiple terabyte image file that would be gigantic. So I've decided to make a dependency chart for a single quest in RuneScape. You might be worried, hey, that's comparing apples to oranges. You can't show us WoW at the expansion level and then talk about one quest in RuneScape. But RuneScape's structure is fractal, just like WoW and Final Fantasy XIV. If you zoom out from just the one quest, the overall structure of the game looks pretty similar. Let's make this a subsection, Why RuneScape is not an MMO, part 3.5, OSRS Quest Dependency Chart. So here is the dependency chart for a single mid-game quest in RuneScape, the Legends quest. Holy so I'm going to walk you through this. I wanted to start by displaying the whole thing just to try to hit you with how huge this game is. Remember, this is a single mid-game quest. Not just every quest, but almost every activity in all of RuneScape has a dependency chart that looks like this. And as a side note, I now have a renewed respect for Mark at GMTK. This chart took me many, many hours to complete. There will be a link to the ping in the description if you're interested. Also, if you think you get the point and you don't want to listen to me spending 10 minutes explaining it, feel free to skip to the next segment. There should be some timestamps on the play bar to do that. Okay, for the people who are still here and want to learn how to read this, there is a legend for this thing, but I don't just want to display that and let you figure it out. So let me hide most of the chart and let's dive into each of the specifics one by one. Okay, first of all, let's just look at skills. The Legends quest has skill prerequisites from 13 of RuneScape's 23 skills. That means before you're even allowed to attempt the Legends quest, you have to at least raise all of these skills up to a specific level. GMTK's dependency charts generally deal with Zelda-like games and Metroidvanias where experience points aren't really a thing. So the concept of leveling a skill doesn't map perfectly onto Mark's chart design. So I'm using a pentagon here to mean gain XP in this skill to progress, moving down the chart. Let's add in the keys, which in this case are skill levels. As with GMTK's charts, a diamond is a key. And I've color-coded the keys starting from top to bottom. A blue key requires that skill to be at levels 1 through 10, while on the other end, a red key requires a skill at between levels 51 through 60. So right now, if you were just planning out your day and you wanted to see if you could attempt the Legends quest, you could just look at this part of the chart and ask, are my skills high enough level to reach the bottom of each of these paths? So I've described leveling the skills on the right as keys. Now we need to add the locks that they unlock. I'm going to go ahead and add them all the way on the left side of the chart. I've also updated the legend to show that a square...
I have such a different lens on these quests now. When I was a kid, these quests were so much fun, but I didn't ever really think about how much goes into designing these dependencies and how different this is to most quests and other MMOs. I mean, this is crazy. Oh shoot, Juan, you're vibe coding a football league manager. That sounds fun. Do you have a link to the project? Do you have it? You're just working on it locally still? I'd love to see that.
There is a lock or obstacle. As you can see, we need to have a high enough skill level from these 10 skills to be able to reach the quest at the end. And updating the legend again, I'm using a circle here to mean a quest. GMTK uses circles to indicate a boss fight or a challenge. So in Metroidvania, you fight a boss and then you typically get an unlock or a key after you beat the boss. In RuneScape, completing a quest is a key. So just know that whenever you see a circle, it's both a challenge to overcome, like a boss, and a key once it's complete. But hang on, you may have noticed a problem here. There are 13 skill keys on the right side, but I specifically said there's only 10 skill locks needed to complete the Legends quest. 3 of the skills are missing. Keep that in your mind, we're going to come back to it soon. First, let me introduce quest points. So I said that quests in RuneScape have a complicated list of prerequisites that draw from both skill levels and quest completions. So the Legends quest does require you to do a set of specific mandatory quests before you can attempt it, but it also requires quest points. So what are quest points? Every quest in the game awards some amount of quest points, and that technically means that this dependency chart should be even more complicated. Legends Quest requires 107 quest points, and that means the player could complete any combination of quests in the entire game that awards that many quest points to qualify. And each of those quests has their own set of prerequisites. So if I tried to account for that level of complexity, the chart would have to be like 10 times bigger. And to simplify things, I'm only going to be including those mandatory quests on this chart, and I've simplified quest points as a single lock and key task. You can read this as similar to the skills on the right. There are 3 quest point keys you obtain by completing quests and raising your quest point totals. The most difficult red lock to pass is for the Legends quest, so I've added a red lock on the far left. So that gets us to the complicated part, the mandatory quests. So remember that in addition to sometimes needing degenerate quest points that you can get from any quest, most quests also have a list of specific mandatory prerequisite quests that must be completed before that quest can even be attempted. And this is that list of specific prerequisites for Legends Quest. Let's go ahead and add those back to the legend at the bottom. The icons here are just items that you get in those quests. It helps me to give them a unique visual indicator. Now that those are back in the legend, let's add in the specific highest level quests that are required for Legends Quest. As these are all obstacles to progress, they are squares or locks on the left side of the chart. And I'm going to repurpose the different colors we were using for skill levels. We're going to use that for quest complexity. So a blue quest has simple prerequisites, a red quest has really complicated prerequisites. So these here on the left are the main locks you would have to pass. to attempt the Legends quest. But like how you would need to get the speed booster and the super missile and the power bomb before you can get the space jump in Super Metroid, each of these locks on the left has their own set of prerequisites. So we got to put those back on the board. There's still a ton of empty space above these. Let's start filling that in. Like I said, each quest has its own prerequisites. So let's fill in the prereqs for just one of them, Hero's Quest, which is the most complicated quest required for Legends Quest. Here we see that Hero's Quest itself requires quest points, along with requiring 4 other quests. And there's still more empty space below. We'll get to that in a second. Let's add in Hero's Quest's requirements onto the chart as their own quests. You can see that another one of the new quests we've added here, Dragon Slayer 1, also requires quest points to attempt. I imagine that you're starting to get the idea, so let's just add all of the remaining quests and associated locks onto the chart. You can start to make out some quest chains here, and you might also notice something interesting in the top right. There's now a lock above the Herblore skill. That's because technically the player can't level up Herblore until they complete the introduction quest called Druidic Ritual. So knowing that we can't start leveling Herblore until we complete Druidic Ritual, let's think about a brand new player for a second. Say you've got a new account, fresh out of the tutorial, you want to complete the Legends quest. You've just picked it as an arbitrary goal to work toward. What can you do right away out of the tutorial to make progress towards your goal? Well, you could do anything at the top of the chart. The 5 quests in the top left have no prerequisites, so a brand new account could rush them immediately. And since you need quest points, you could also try to earn those by completing any of the other quests in the game that have no prerequisites. 12 of the 13 skills could be trained immediately by a new character. So if your ultimate goal is to finish the Legends quest, you can work on any one of these 12 skills right away and be making meaningful progress toward that goal. Quick aside here, I already mentioned that this chart is simpler than it should be because I've abstracted quest points into just one simple vertical node. It's actually way more complicated than that, because I said earlier that each of those skills on the right is sort of a sub game in and of itself. Pick any one of those skills and it offers dozens of ways to level it with varying XP rates, difficulty, required attention levels, and so on. So if you were frustrated at me earlier for oversimplifying World of Warcraft to complete an expansion or do the quests in a zone, I want you to know that a very similar level of abstraction is happening in these little pentagons here. Like, each pentagon means level the skill, but depending on how you're playing, you could be doing one of a dozen or so activities to level it. And each of those activities has its own fractal dependency chart of what you need to do to unlock the activity. Are you still with me? We're almost done. Let's get back to the chart here. There's still some empty space on the left. Those empty nodes are, of course, the skill requirements for each of the remaining prerequisite quests. Since each quest has a skill requirement, there are multiple keys for each skill on the right. Now that we've added in the missing locks, remember when we talked about how there are 13 skills on the right, but only 10 skills needed for Legends Quest? Here are those 3 missing skills. It's because Legends Quest itself technically doesn't require you to level up cooking, fishing, or ranged, but some of its prerequisite quests do. Whew, thanks for joining me on that journey. That's how you read this ridiculous chart. Let's get back to the self-direction section here. Let's underscore 2 things from the chart. If I were to make the real Legends Quest dependency chart, it would need to be about 10 times bigger than this, as I would need to account for the true complexity of quest points and the various optional skilling methods on the right. And 2, I want you to appreciate the idea that this is a little fractal microcosm of the entire game's structure. You could make a chart like this for fight a boss, or complete an achievement, or complete all the quests in the game, or even make a subchart for any one of the skills. And let me be careful here, because I'm not saying that modern MMOs can't or don't have content that's structured like this. When I was shopping this draft around to people, several folks pointed out that this reminded them of old school WoW raid attunement. And I'd say it also kind of looks like legendary weapon quests in both WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, or those once per expansion ARG brain teasers that pop up for hardcore players in WoW. RuneScape's use of the structure is different, and there are several reasons. Number 1 is just sheer scope. Complex dependency can be found throughout all of RuneScape, but in WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, content like that is optional and rare these days. Number 2, solo versus group play. If your first thought when you saw the Legends Quest chart was, oh my god, that reminds me of attunement, gross, like, you're right to be worried, Attunement has been gone for so long from WoW, I should probably just introduce it here. Back in the day, if you wanted to participate in endgame raiding with other players, you had to perform a long, complicated sequence of mostly solo challenges to unlock the raid. It created this atmosphere of players needing to like eat their vegetables or do their homework in order to be able to get to the dessert of playing with their friends. People hated attuning to raids in WoW, and for good reason. My argument is just that the reason we hated it didn't have a lot to do with the structure of the chart, the complex decision tree, right? We're going to talk about this way more in the upcoming section on single player, but my argument is that what we hated about attunement had more to do with the division between solo and group content. Because number three, content emphasis and overlap, in case it wasn't clear, every node on the Legends Quest dependency chart represents an activity the player will eventually want to engage with anyway for its own sake. Each skill has payoffs elsewhere in the game. You're not just leveling these skills to complete the Legends Quest, they each have their own functionality, and they're each prerequisites for other quests, boss fights, and minigames. None of this content on this chart is particularly emphasized or incentivized. There's no particular reason to do any of the quests on this chart before any of the other quests, or to go after clearing the Legends quest itself, or to do any of these skills first. And that differs from something like an attunement quest chain in WoW, where there is a content emphasis. The endgame group rating provides the best gear in the game, but most of the activities you need to do for attunement are not tasks that you'd want to undertake for their own sake. Like, except for the two things at the bottom in green, getting a flying mount and hitting level cap, this is homework. With that, we're coming up on yet another detour here. There's going to be several more. Let's talk for a second about developer intent. Okay, so you can play any video game however you like. You've probably heard of the concept of death of the author, the idea that authorial intent doesn't matter when appreciating a work. It's true in literature, in film, very true in video games. If you want to make a panda character in World of Warcraft and never leave the starting zone, you can do that. Make your own game. And it's where we get awesome gaming subcultures like speedrunning by saying, hey, let's take this video game that's the brainchild of a bunch of developers who all have clear intents about how they want us to play it, and let's treat it as a sandbox. What other sub games can we find inside of the system? That's why we speedrun Ocarina of Time, or we do no-hit Dark Souls runs, or we create elaborate role-playing servers in Grand Theft Auto, because we crave the ability to self-direct. So how does developer intent fit into that? Every developer wants to give players the feeling of freedom, but every game inevitably incentivizes some behaviors over others, emphasizes some content over others, and gives clear priorities to players. We've iterated so heavily on the design shape of MMOs that in modern games, it's pretty clear what you ought to be doing. And games like WoW and FF14 do give players a lot of freedom to explore. I'm not saying that Blizzard or Square Enix set out to make these like on rails linear player prisons, or that those games are linear or bad. And I don't even think that linearity is a bad thing. I actively prefer a tight developer directed experience over a clumsy sandbox most of the time. These games are huge and they're fun and they're good. But as developers have cleaned up the genre and sanded down the rough edges and made thousands of little iterative decisions that each made sense on their own, we've slowly moved towards systems where the developer intent is very heavily signposted and where what you ought to be doing is very clear and easy to understand. Here it is again, it's a trade-off. And for many players, this is a huge benefit for them of modern MMOs, that you can just pick them up and play them and not scratch your head wondering what Blizzard wants from you. What makes RuneScape special to me is it's not that the game is old and confusing and you have no idea where to go or what to do. You could start playing with no guide, no wiki, just explore around you, and doing so will make reasonable progress for your account. The way the game is structured, just about anything you do will be productive for your account. None of it's particularly emphasized or de-emphasized in the design. In WoW or FF14, your options often look like this. It's clear which of the carrots you should go after first. But RuneScape looks more like this. Maybe the individual carrots are slightly bigger or smaller than one another, but at the end of the day, there's not an obvious path to take. And even if you wanted to take the obvious path by having all of these skills and quests and unlocks, the game is too complex for anybody, especially the developers, to ever sit down and adequately signpost what you ought to be doing. It's like the most complicated traveling salesman optimization problem of all time. If you haven't heard of it, in the traveling salesman problem, you want to visit all of these red dots exactly once, like a salesman going door to door. What is the shortest line that connects all the dots? The traveling salesman problem is really hard for humans to solve by hand, and depending on how many dots you have, it can also be tough for supercomputers to solve. But imagine if each of those dots represented a different RuneScape skill, quest, or desirable item, and you were trying to figure out the most optimal order in which to do them. The traveling salesman problem is only concerned with distance, but imagine if it also had to account for like running out of gas, what the time of day was, the work schedules of each of your customers, and so on. There are so many variables at play in RuneScape that it's impossible to arrive at a clear and obvious meta that all players must follow. And that might sound intimidating, but my point is that the shape of the game makes it so that it can never be clear what you ought to be doing next. You don't have to worry about optimization paralysis because it's impossible to optimize. You're free to self direct. Should I level herb lore or agility or mining or combat first? Like, veteran RuneScape players might be able to help you to narrow things down, but most folks will answer, well, what do you want to do, right? The baseline experience of playing RuneScape is fundamentally very open and free. Like, pick any two veteran players and ask them to compare their paths through the game. They're going to look crazy different. And I'm simplifying path through the game as a traveling salesman problem where you visit each point once. Realistically, you have to revisit each skill at least hundreds of times in your journey. Personally, I spent the first 30 hours of my playthrough focusing on a single skill, and I might be the only newbie player in the history of the game to have ever done that. But I'm not an unusual player. I'm not breaking the game or playing it in a way that isn't intended, like that WoW player who reaches the level cap in every expansion without leaving the Panda starting zone. Every RuneScape player's experience is unique, more so than in other MMOs. And don't get it twisted, RuneScape has Death of the Author players who make their own game too. We're going to talk about these accounts in future sections, but RuneScape is the perfect game to turn into your own personal sandbox on top of everything else. I know that this self direction section is like painfully long, but it's one of the areas where RuneScape shines the brightest, and there's a lot to say. It's just a little bit further now. I've demonstrated how this dependency chart represents a way RuneScape is fundamentally different from other MMOs. I focused a lot on the way most content is required in RuneScape's core structure, in the sense that you eventually need to level all of these skills and do all of these quests if you want to see all the content. But I want to talk a little bit more about optional content. So, most Metroidvanias have optional upgrades that are not part of the critical path to completing the game. They increase the feeling of freedom to explore by giving you upgrades that change your core gameplay without being absolutely necessary to progress. And RuneScape has these too, often in the form of unlocking a more efficient leveling method, like this quest reward that makes smithing faster, or this shield that makes a boss more viable to fight repeatedly, or this achievement unlock that increases the rewards from doing unrelated activities. If you like to plan out what you're going to do in a game, RuneScape makes it very compelling to log into the game and try to develop your own route that gets you to the most relevant rewards as soon as possible. As we said in the traveling salesman thing, you can't take the perfectly optimal route. It's too complicated for you to figure it out. So it comes down to just making choices that make sense for you and your play session that day. Planning your day in RuneScape is like routing a speed run. Not actually running a speed run, but figuring out the route. You miniaturize that, you reduce the stakes significantly because speedrun routing is extremely high stakes, and routing your day in RuneScape is pretty low stakes by comparison. Like, since you got to do everything eventually, there's not a big time loss for doing thieving training before farming training or whatever. If you're the kind of person who likes to think about the game that you're playing, even when you're not playing it, if you're on site at work or on the toilet and thinking, man, I can't wait to get back and play some video games, like RuneScape is the game for that. This is the ultimate think about what you're going to do even when you're not playing it game. This makes RuneScape the perfect game to exploit a particular kind of enjoyment loop that I love. On the stream, I've always referred to it as the "ooh, a piece of candy" effect after this skit from Family Guy. But that's a really long name, "ooh, a piece of candy," so let's simplify that and call it the candy loop. The candy loop is the satisfying feeling of being distracted from whatever you set out to do, and then getting distracted again and again and again. For a distraction loop to be a candy loop, it has to be a positive feeling. It's not the same as having a game that requires you to keep track of all the balls in the air and focus your attention on the most urgent thing. When distractions are stressful, that's difficulty, not dopamine, but it's good in a different way. Games with candy loops don't punish you for being distracted. Whatever you left behind when you got distracted will still be waiting for you there whenever you get back to it. There's not like a ticking time limit or an inherent opportunity cost to pursuing one piece of candy over another. If you see 3 interesting things, just do the one that excites you the most. You can do the other 2 later, right? So the candy loop is about distraction, but the kind of distraction that is delightful instead of stressful. And most veteran RuneScape players will tell you that this game has candy loops in spades. The game is basically about setting out to do one thing and then getting 10 layers of distraction deep before you ask, wait, I was trying to level crafting. What am I doing, farming again? All of this, the dependency charts, the candy loops, it adds up to mean that anytime you log in, there's a million things that you can do in RuneScape, and they're all equally valid ways of playing. No one's going to yell at you because you can't play RuneScape wrong. And that naturally brings us to why RuneScape is not an MMO, Part 4, single player, or getting to the good part. A big part of the reason RuneScape excels so much in that self-direction department is because the game is primarily a single-player experience. Now, it's not unusual for MMOs. Hour for hour, a large chunk of your time in an MMO is likely going to be spent solo, but the weighting is very different in RuneScape. At time of recording, I played about 3,000 hours of the game. Looking through my past videos, I can say that the first time I ever seriously attempted group content at all was at the 1,200 hour mark. And in my 3,000 hours of play, I've spent maybe 150 hours doing group content max. The rest of my time has been playing the game completely solo. Referencing that Dan Olson video about WoW Classic again, Dan talks about the concept of social solo play, or playing alone together. There's a unique character to a game that is primarily played alone, but alongside other people who are also playing the game alone. It's a different experience than if RuneScape was just a private idle game that you downloaded onto your machine. In that video, Dan mostly focuses on the social benefit, which if you've had a social solo experience before, I think is self-evident. Another huge benefit is what RuneScape's developers call game integrity. This is going to be another detour. I originally had a whole section on the concept of integrity, and maybe I'll make a separate video on it someday because it applies to all video games, not just RuneScape. In lieu of a full section, I hope you'll permit yet another tangent for me on it here. So, I haven't seen the term integrity used in this way elsewhere in the industry, but it matters in some way to every developer out there. Game integrity is the feeling that the time and effort you've invested in a game is reasonably comparable to the time and effort of other players. That if you made it to a difficult boss fight in Dark Souls, you can count on the fact that other players who made it to the same boss had to invest a roughly similar amount of blood, sweat, and tears to get there. Now, later, we're going to talk about the dark side of this when we talk about gatekeeping and hazing culture, which are kind of a problem in RuneScape. There's a big debate right now in game design about accessibility and whether developers should even be allowed to make intentionally inaccessible games. Check out this great video from Game Maker's Toolkit for some really awesome discussion on the topic. It's easy to look at the issue as black and white and say either a game is accessible or it isn't, full stop, or to say either a game is rewarding or it isn't, full stop. And we just talk past one another like these ideas are in conflict in some way. Like, I'd like to invite you to consider that this concept of game integrity, like most issues out there, has nuance to it. We can respect when developers try to curb cheating and remove exploits from their games because it preserves the integrity of the experience. We can recognize that there is value in knowing that when you say, I beat Ornstein and Smo, other people who have played the game will have a rough understanding of what you went through, we can believe both of those things, and we can also look down on gatekeeping and hazing culture and try to make gaming accessible for as many people as possible. These ideas don't need to be contradictory. Okay, long rant. What does that have to do with RuneScape and single player in particular? I mentioned earlier in the video that this would not be the same game if it was a downloadable offline title. The social aspect that Dan Olson gets into is really important, but I think that the feeling of game integrity is just as important. This is a game that beckons you to play it for thousands of hours. Why would anyone play it legitimately if anyone could easily cheat? If it was offline, how easy would it be to hack in accomplishments that other players invested hundreds of hours working toward? How would you know the difference? And let me just say this, by the way, video games don't matter. Well, I mean, I'd argue that nothing matters, but let's admit this about video games in particular. Games don't matter. We play them to relax and to have fun. And deep down, literally everyone understands this. We like to pretend like this is special knowledge that some people have. For whatever reason, some people will use this as a conversation-ending bludgeon. They'll cheat at a game and then go, well, why do you care? Don't you know it's just a game? It doesn't matter, as though they have some special insight that none of us had thought of before. We all know this, but we play games anyway. How do we deal with this, like, ennui, the dissonance of engaging with something that you know is pointless? So I'm going to introduce another term here. In fiction and film criticism, we like to talk about the willing suspension of disbelief. The idea is that in order to enjoy fiction, we have to be willing to temporarily accept things that aren't realistic but which serve the story in some way. I'd like to argue that for many games, not just video games, but sports, conventional board games, tabletop RPGs, in order for us to fully enjoy them, we need to have what I'm going to call a willing suspension of nihilism. That is, to enjoy games to their fullest, we have to agree to collectively pretend, at least temporarily, that what we're doing matters. And this is why people get upset when an athlete gets caught cheating, or a ref makes a bad call, or a dungeon master is caught fudging rolls. DM screens exist to protect the illusion that fudging isn't happening. Or if bots show up and ruin the economy of an MMO, it's because we all know deep down that this is all just an elaborate waste of time, and we don't want that bubble to be popped. Maintaining the illusion that games matter is critical to our enjoyment of them. I think that's part of the definition of this game integrity idea. It's the efforts by the powers that be, whether that's sports referees or dungeon masters or game designers. It's their efforts to help players and audiences preserve the willing suspension of nihilism. And it's not perfect. Even when the powers that be are trying their hardest to maintain the appearance of fairness, people still find ways to cheat, and RuneScape is not free of those problems. But I'm going to put forward that, for me at least, even though RuneScape is primarily a single-player game and I don't need the social interactions with other players, if you made it into an offline RuneScape clone, I wouldn't want to touch that client with a 1,000-foot pole. Even though I barely interact with other players, the fact that I'm doing all of this on servers with other people who are following the same rules that I have to follow enhances the experience for me significantly. Thanks for entertaining that tangent. There's going to be more. Okay, back to MMOs. Many modern MMOs end load their content focus, and they say almost explicitly, the current expansion and the most recent patch are where you should be if you want to experience our game. We're going to talk about this a lot more in the next section on dead content, but I want to bring it up here because it plays into the pressure that games place on players. Because modern games end load most of their multiplayer content and they want to catch you up to their end game, there is a pressure to clear through the solo content as quickly as possible in order to reach that multiplayer endgame. So imagine you have a set of blocks of content that you can complete. The red blocks represent endgame multiplayer content, and the blue blocks represent early game solo content. A green check mark in a box means the content is done, there's no reason to ever return to it, and a red X means the content hasn't even been unlocked yet. And this yellow arrow means the content has been unlocked, it's currently relevant to you, you haven't tapped it out yet, you're currently playing through it. Let's look at our modern MMOs and start by looking at a typical endgame player in either WoW or Final Fantasy XIV. The way these games are structured, a typical endgame player has completely tapped out solo content. They might still have some dailies or world quests to do, but for the most part, what they have remaining is endgame multiplayer content. Now compare this to a typical newbie in one of these games who's working through the solo content. The newbie can't access any of the endgame stuff yet and has to work through the early game content sequentially, and it creates a sort of inherent positive feedback pressure loop between endgame players and newbies. The endgame players have no solo content left to do, and so it's important to them to get more friends available to do the only content they have left, the group content. And the new players can't skip to the dessert of fun multiplayer content until they eat their vegetables and complete the solo content. The system creates this permanent implicit time pressure for new players to be catching up as quickly as possible. And I'm not saying that game designers intend their solo content to feel like vegetables. For a lot of people, the solo content is the dessert, and when they tap it out, they just quit. That's how I've been playing MMOs for a while. I don't even mess around with the endgame rating or anything like that. That's completely fine. Like we talked about in the last section, just the act of structuring the content this way impacts player incentives and behaviors, whether they were intended by the developers or not. RuneScape isn't structured that way. Because the game is so heavily weighted towards solo content in general, the chart for an endgame player looks more like this. Endgame players basically always have something productive they could do on their own. There are extremely few players who can really say they have nothing at all they could work on solo that would be a significant improvement for their character. That means that while I would certainly like to find the time here and there to do the group content that I've unlocked with my friends, there's no implicit pressure to do so. It's not the only thing I have to do in the game. I could ask my friends, hey, do you want to do a raid or fight a boss together? Two of the pieces of multiplayer content that I've unlocked. And suppose my friends are newbies. They haven't unlocked the content yet. They can't play with me. In WoW or Final Fantasy XIV, I would be frustrated. Can't they just hurry up so that they can play with me so I can, enjoy this game more? But in RuneScape, it's not a problem because I have so many other things to do. I'm just going to go do some farm runs or try to gain an agility level or two. I have to do that stuff anyway, and it's going to improve my character when we eventually get to the group content. And if you're modeling RuneScape as a typical MMO, none of this makes sense to you because group content is more work, so shouldn't it provide better rewards? As we discussed in the last section, RuneScape's rewards are more like distinct Metroidvania upgrades that gate access to different kinds of content, rather than a sequence of strict mathematical upgrades. In Super Metroid, you can't really say that the high jump is better than the speed boost, or that the super missile is better than the morph ball, because they're not degenerate in that way. They give you different overlapping abilities. Even if you tried to compare offensive abilities, while the super missile does more damage than the regular missile, they are distinct items that have different use cases. We're going to get into this in way more detail when we get to itemization, but for the purposes of this section, imagine that instead of group content offering you strict, linear, mathematical upgrades, instead it unlocks unique progression keys, which will get you through other unique locks elsewhere in the game. It's true that the gear from group-oriented content is often mathematically very good, but the majority of the game's content is not structured in such a way that it will be strictly better than what you're going to find in solo content. Before we get to the next section here, I think that veteran RuneScape players would riot if I didn't mention the Iron Man game mode somewhere in this section on single player. So RuneScape's self-directed solo experience is so well crafted that people are hungry for more of it. I threw up a few shoutouts to popular Iron Man content creators in the previous section, and I could spend a whole video talking about the concept, but to just briefly get the idea in front of you, Iron Man mode is an extremely popular game mode in old school RuneScape, and it restricts your ability to interact with other accounts. Primarily, it blocks you from trading with other players or from using the game's auction house. People like Iron Man because it makes an already solo game even more solo. Since you can't trade for things, less of the content is degenerate. When we discussed this dependency chart in the last section, I talked up how cool it is that you have to train all these different skills to do this one quest. Well, if you have access to money and to trading, then a lot of these skills degenerate to find the best way to grind for money and then buy the thing you need to level the skill. Buy the quest items, buy ingredients, buy runes, buy ammo. Iron Man can make more of the content feel more relevant in a game where a shockingly high percentage of the content already feels non-degenerate. As highlighted here, Even if you were a normal account and bought as many items as you could, you would still need to manually level up and complete these quests. You're still having to put in a lot of work. So that's Iron Man. We'll talk a little bit more about Iron Man later, but just kind of talking about single player in general, because RuneScape so heavily weights single player content over group content, it frees you from external pressure. And I'm trying really hard not to just fully regurgitate Dan Olson's video. Please just go watch it if you want to learn more about this concept and about social dependency in MMOs, which is a big part of the reason I burned out on every other MMO I've ever played. The point is, when you're playing an MMO, you might feel like you need to burn through solo content quickly to get to the good part where you can play with your friends. And to be fair to WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, I love those games. I think their models work great in their own ecosystems. If you're playing WoW or FF14 right at launch, everyone's right there with you as you quest your way to the endgame, and it can be an absolute blast. The trade-off for being able to see all of the content quickly in modern MMOs is that your old solo content, which was the premium, exciting thing to do on launch week, becomes more and more of a slog as it gets older and older. But in RuneScape, since you have to sink hundreds or thousands of hours into soloing through everything, the whole game is the good part, no matter how much time passes from when the content was released. Speaking of the good part, and speaking of old content, why RuneScape is not an MMO, Part 5, Content Deprecation, or RuneScape has no dead content. So, online games have a major dilemma. Once you've iterated on your title for years, and your game has multiple expansions worth of content, how can you possibly pitch such a behemoth of a product to new players? Different games have different approaches to the problem. I'm going to run through some examples, but first we got to define some more terms. Deprecation is a term that's used in software development to mean the discouragement of the ongoing use of some feature without its explicit removal. Features are often deprecated rather than outright removed when newer, more efficient features are added to replace them. This happens all the time in game design, and I'm going to call it content deprecation. So what is that? Deprecated content is old content that hasn't been explicitly removed from the game, but which no longer exists in its original mechanical form, or which no longer provides relevant rewards. Virtually all online games have deprecated content. It's difficult to design new features for a game without discouraging players from continuing to interact with the old ones. The old content is usually still available, but it hasn't been kept up to code, so to speak. By playing it now, you are not getting the originally intended experience. Dead content is the most extreme form of deprecated content. It happens when your content is so old or has such bad rewards that there is simply no reason for players to touch it ever again. And we can bring back that fancy word from much earlier and say that all of a game's dead content is also necessarily degenerate content. It exists in the game, but it's functionally indistinguishable from having been removed from the game, and each piece of dead content is functionally indistinguishable from each other piece of dead content when reviewed from that rewards or mechanics angle. Players like to throw around the term dead content, but I think it's important to keep in mind that content deprecation is not a binary thing. It's a gradient. It's not that content is either dead or not dead. It's a question of how deprecated the content is. And you can think of a game's older content as falling on two axes: mechanical deprecation and reward deprecation. If we combine these axes, we can start to talk about the relevance of old content in games. Let me describe what the different points along these axes look like. If the x-axis is the mechanical deprecation axis, then on the far right side we have content that is mechanically modern and therefore not deprecated at all. If you play the content now, you're going to get the same play experience as if you played it on the day it launched. Slightly left of it, we have deprecated content. It's not the same as it was on launch, maybe due to changes in the game's math or other tweaks. Left of center, we have what I'm going to call mechanically trivial or face roll content. Content that may have been difficult at some point, but is so severely deprecated that it is trivial to complete now, no longer looks anything like its original form at all. And then all the way on the left, we have content deleted. The content literally is not accessible anymore. On the y-axis, we have rewards deprecation. And remember that deprecation in development just means that a feature's use is discouraged. When it comes to game design, I think it's useful to think about whether a feature was discouraged because it's trivial now or because it provides bad or irrelevant rewards. At the top of the y-axis, I'm calling it progression rewards, and I just That means different things in different games. Here I mean whether the content provides gear, currency, or experience points that matter to an endgame player in the current expansion trying to unlock the latest patch content. Further down are relevant rewards, side grades, optional items, corner case unlocks, things like crafting ingredients that might still matter in the current patch cycle. Below the center are leveling or cosmetic rewards, not relevant to the current patch, might provide decent XP during a leveling process, or players might want to do it to unlock optional cosmetics. And at the very bottom, we have dead rewards. That means the old content provides nothing, there's no reason to do it other than for its own sake. So we can start plopping games on the graph here to talk about how relevant their old content is, but first, I'm going to bring this up in every section. A game's position on this graph isn't saying anything about that game's quality. You can't say, why don't developers just keep all of their old content mechanically up to date with great rewards? There are significant costs to doing that. When developers allow content to become deprecated, it allows them to focus their attention and resources elsewhere. That's why software developers deprecate things in the first place. So with that said, let's plop some games on here and talk about them. Start with World of Warcraft. So in WoW, after every expansion, the current expansion is treated as the prime content. Players are assumed to want to skip to it as quickly as possible. Allowing players to straight up create a level boosted character is pretty typical, and all content created prior to the current expansion is immediately deprecated. It's still in the game, you can level through it, but minimal effort is made to bring that content up to code. Old dungeons and raids are never able to be accessed again as they were originally implemented, as patches and math changes have totally trivialized them. Now, Blizzard has started releasing what they're calling time-walking dungeons, where you can go back to an old dungeon and the math is roughly scaled to the modern standard. But it's not exactly right. You still have different abilities than what those dungeons had on launch. They're a limited time. They can't be accessed whenever the player feels like it. Part of the problem is that this level scaling thing, WoW wasn't built with that idea from the ground up, but Final Fantasy XIV was. Now, Final Fantasy XIV also considers the newest expansion to be prime content, but it's less concerned with rushing players to it as quickly as possible. There are optional paid ways to skip to the end, but because Final Fantasy XIV is part visual novel, it does require you to play through the old main story quest from prior expansions until you catch up to the endgame. This means that you still see all of the mandatory dungeons and boss fights along the way. Now, FF14 was built from the ground up with a level syncing system that helps to stop content from prior expansions from becoming completely trivialized face roll content, but changes to the itemization and the combat math and the abilities generally makes it so that the older the content is, the more trivialized it becomes in the leveling process. There's generally no reason to engage with older optional content at all, other than to try to unlock cosmetics. And since the game lets you disable level syncing, if you're going for old cosmetics, you're typically trivializing the content to do so, because why wouldn't you, right? So the point of this graph is to compare MMOs to RuneScape. I mean, that's what this essay is supposed to be about. I could keep charting MMOs on the graph, but they're all going to end up around this center area that I'm going to call the MMO zone. Before we get to RuneScape, I'm going to branch out to one other genre so we can see examples in the other quadrants of the graph. So we're going to talk about looter games / action RPGs. Now, the way looter games try to approach the content deprecation problem is by having a seasonal system where progress is reset regularly so that people can try to join in and start out on the same page. That's how games like Destiny and Path of Exile approach the problem, but they have nearly opposite ways of handling it. Destiny is an extreme case of rushing players to the endgame. It's so extreme that the developers have effectively deleted old content from the game entirely. So I've put Destiny all the way in the lower left because it does outright delete content, and any old content it leaves in the game is functionally irrelevant from a rewards perspective too. I would call this lower left quadrant the FOMO zone. These games are all about FOMO, or the fear of missing out. FOMO games are constantly saying, you should be playing the newest content right now because next patch, it could be gone forever. I've probably made that sound like a bad thing, but it depends on what kind of player you are. I personally don't care for FOMO games, but Bungie is admittedly able to do a lot with Destiny because of their design approach. Because they're so willing to just throw everything out constantly, they can reshape the game from patch to patch. And whether that feeling of FOMO is a plus or a minus for you depends on your tastes as a player. On the other side, Path of Exile makes an admirable effort to avoid outright deleting old content from the game. Even though the game has dozens of mechanics, items, and currencies added over years of patches, you can't say that the game has no dead content. In fact, playing the game can be a bit of a headache-inducing nightmare as you try to sift through the content that's irrelevant versus the content that will meaningfully impact your progress. Path of Exile has kept everything around, but like 99% of it is dead, and it's left up to the player to learn how to discriminate between the two. And again, like with Destiny, I've managed to make that sound bad, but learning which content is relevant and which content can be ignored is a big part of mastering Path of Exile. The moment-to-moment gameplay in Path of Exile is a Diablo-like action RPG, but the more strategic, big-picture part of the game is a problem-solving puzzle game. It's looking for the right build needles in the content haystack, so to speak. I want to show you an example for each quadrant, so let's throw Diablo 3 up there. Diablo 3's older content is still in the game. You can still play through story mode or even through the game's older act-based content in adventure mode, and in fact the game offers specific non-degenerate rewards to get you to do that, but the content is mechanically trivial compared to what you're going to encounter in the endgame greater rifts. Alright, that was a lot of talking about other games. Let's plop RuneScape on the graph and see how it's different. So like Final Fantasy XIV and Path of Exile, RuneScape does not intentionally remove old content from the game. It is all still there. And like Final Fantasy XIV, RuneScape requires you to play through the old content in order to progress. There's no way to just skip to the end. Unlike Final Fantasy XIV, though, the content in RuneScape is generally less dead, both from a mechanical and rewards perspective. I can't just summarize for you quickly why RuneScape is in the top right, because it's a natural consequence of every other section of this video. The ones we've already talked about with class design, quest design, that crazy self-direction Metroidvania dependency chart, the single-player nature of the game, but also the sections I haven't gotten to yet that are on the pins list. Obviously, I'm making this video because I like RuneScape a lot, but I assure you that just because RuneScape is in the top right of this graph does not mean that it is the best game listed here. The developers pay extremely high costs in time, resources, and a very restricted design space that other developers don't need to pay in order to keep RuneScape in that top right corner. And to explain what I mean, we need to talk about RuneScape's design philosophy. Alright, why RuneScape is not an MMO, Part 6, Design Philosophy, or Limitations Breed Creativity. So I said that I wasn't going to dive into the differences between old school RuneScape, the classic version of the game, and modern RuneScape, or RuneScape 3, but here I need to give a small amount of context. There's a lot of history to get into, but briefly, RuneScape's developers, Jagex, made an unpopular decision in 2012 to revamp the game's combat system to more closely resemble modern MMOs. The 2012 combat update was the final straw for many players. Before that, they had made some big unpopular changes to trading and PvP and implemented microtransactions into the game. Quick olive branch to RS3 players, I've heard that that game has evolved in a really cool direction, and it's possible to effectively disable microtransactions by playing as an Iron Man account, so I'm personally really looking forward to recording my own blind Questcape playthrough for that soon. In any case, dissatisfaction with the direction RuneScape was going led to demand for the release of a classic version of the game from before these controversial changes were implemented. A 2007 backup was found by Jagex, and they decided to release old school RuneScape based on that codebase. However, and uniquely, Jagex has committed to continuing to patch the old school version of the game to fix bugs, make small adjustments, and to add brand new content. This is a small slice of the brand new content that Jagex has added to old school since it launched in 2013. All of it is unique to OSRS, and it is not in the modern version of the game. It's not just taking RS3 content and backporting it to OSRS. It's completely different storylines and content from the modern version of the game. This OSRS experiment has been running for coming up on 10 years now, and it's been really successful, as we've discussed. WoW Classic owes its existence to the success of old school RuneScape, but its current implementation is really different. At time of recording at least, WoW Classic is trying to keep the experience pristine. No new content, no changes. Unlike classic WoW, old school RuneScape is not an archival game. It's a totally different game now than the 2007 backup it's based on. It's better to think of OSRS as a fork. what if RuneScape developed along a different path with different design objectives? And the success of Old School has led to some discussion about making a WoW Classic Plus that does the same thing, branching out with different content and design objectives from the live game and going in a different direction story wise. So, like, what if WoW Classic Plus continued where Wrath of the Lich King left off, as if the Cataclysm expansion never happened? Back to RuneScape. As part of Jagex's commitment to patching the game, they also have a formal content approval system. All proposed changes to the game must be pulled and passed by a 75% player supermajority in order for proposed content to be added to the game. Now, most new content passes polls without much trouble, but some content gets shut down quickly. And the polling system has a lot of benefits and drawbacks. What it's really done is created this extremely creatively constrained conservative development environment where the devs don't even want to spend time on ideas that might fail a poll. There's a lot of complexity around the design philosophy for OSRS and the voting strategy of the player base, but I'm going to try to summarize their design objectives as much as possible. Okay, so objective number 1. Newly added content should not deprecate existing content. This one is the golden rule, and all of the other objectives are just drilling down into the specifics. If you remember one thing about Jagex's design objectives, remember this. Number 2, newly added gear should not deprecate existing gear. Number 3, newly added leveling methods should not deprecate existing leveling methods. Seeing a pattern here. Number 4, patches and changes to the game's core mechanics should not inadvertently deprecate any of the game's core content. And number 5, content should not be retuned in a way which invalidates the work of players who have already done that content the hard way. So if you imagine this giant box as the available design space for a modern MMO, then these 5 objectives imply that the design space for new content in OSRS is extremely limited in comparison. But limitations breed creativity, and Jagex has found ways to add all sorts of new content to the game that more or less fall within these 5 objectives, to the point where it's now a completely new kind of product. And these objectives contrast really sharply with every other MMO and every other kind of online game. You know, you can grind for dozens or hundreds of hours in WoW or Final Fantasy XIV's endgame and kit yourself out with the best raid gear possible, but at the end of the day, by the next expansion, they're going to raise the level cap. Even by the next patch, they're going to raise the gear cap, and it's effectively going to wipe out all of your progress and start you out on the same footing as a brand new player. I've been really positive in this video so far, but I need to be honest here. I love old school RuneScape for how different it is from the MMOs that I'm used to, but it's not all upside. Objective number 5 in particular generates a sort of hazing culture in the game, where longtime players insist if I had to suffer through a bad gameplay loop, new players should have to deal with it too. And this creates a kind of paradox of bad content. In a typical online game, you would expect developers to prioritize fixing or removing the least fun content in the game first. But in OSRS, the objectively worst content is paradoxically the least likely to ever get updated because players have already suffered through it the hard way. And there are tons of quality of life features that are missing from OSRS, and when players request those features, Jagex has to respond, well, we wish we would have thought of that when we first launched Old School back in 2013, but now that so many players have already suffered without it, it's too late for us to add it. And God, it hurts my little heart whenever I hear them say that. But like I keep saying, it is rare for game design decisions to be a strict upgrade with no downside whatsoever. Nearly all design decisions are trade-offs or side grades. When something is gained, something else is lost. In this case, the hazing culture and the bad content paradox are unfortunate but inevitable consequences of the very design philosophy that makes OSRS so unique. I was talking about game integrity in the single player section and how it feels good sometimes to feel like you're having about the same experience as every other player playing the game, and that your experience isn't going to get invalidated at some point. That's a really good feeling, but as with Dark Souls, offering that comes at a huge cost. Just like I would argue that WoW loses something by letting players skip to the endgame so quickly, this is the price OSRS has to pay for the content to never become dead. And for me, at least, that's worth it. So there's still a couple items left on the pin list. Let's go back to one that's come up in multiple prior sections. Why RuneScape is not an MMO, Part 7, Itemization, or You Need to Own Everything. So I've talked a lot in the last couple sections about Jagex's philosophy and how it allows them to avoid deprecating old content, but how does that even work? And I think it's a case where trying to model RuneScape like an MMO is going to make things really confusing for you. Recapping the class design section a bit, in a modern MMO, you pick one combat class at character creation, and that class defines your ability to unlock all future content. Combat classes in MMOs are degenerate. They're progress degenerate, they lead to the same outcome. And combat progression is a straight line. You gain XP for your combat class, and as you level up, you gain access to more content. Usually, by the end game, you need to also have a minimum gear item level, or eye level, to progress as well. Now, itemization in MMOs used to be crazy complicated, but over the decades, it has streamlined to the point where it's more or less linear. It's just a straight line going up. New gear either increases your item level or it doesn't. RuneScape's approach to itemization is very different, and I want to talk about how. So, number one, players are expected to be warriors, rangers, and mages, often at the same time. RuneScape is balanced around this so-called combat triangle, a sort of rock, paper, scissors rule system for which combat style beats and is beaten by which combat style. The way it works, magic beats melee, melee beats ranged, ranged beats magic. That means that melee gear tends to be inherently weak to magic, magic gear tends to be inherently weak to ranged, and so on, and that applies both offensively and defensively. For example, wearing a full set of heavy melee armor incurs a huge penalty to magic accuracy. Some encounters in the game can be approached using only one of these styles. For example, there are plenty of bosses who are weak to magic, but strong or immune to melee or ranged, and so you would go fight them using just your magic gear setup. But other bosses have phases where you need to use multiple combat styles, and using multiple combat styles in RuneScape means something very specific. It means equipping different gear, so bringing a different set of gear in your inventory and then switching to it. The RuneScape community appropriately refers to that as a switch. So in a fight that requires all three combat styles, you might have 2 sets of extra gear in your inventory, in addition to the one you have equipped that you switch between for different mechanics. So like just out of the gate, it's not enough to just have a good sword or a good bow or a good staff. To do all of the game's content, you need all 3. And speaking of the concept of a good sword, number 2, there's no such thing as best in slot. It's okay to scratch your head at that, because how is that even possible? It's kind of a half-truth. If you're mentally modeling RuneScape as a typical modern MMO, then it is true. There is no such thing as an item that is best in slot for every possible application. It's untrue just based on the way combat works. Because MMO players are accustomed to upgrading their character's gear. Whether you're a warlock in WoW or a monk in Final Fantasy XIV, there are stats you want and stats you don't want, and any given piece of gear is either better than what you have or it isn't. That's how the concept of best in slot for a patch cycle comes into play. You can say, in most cases, this helmet is the best helmet for warlocks until the next patch adds a better one. But that's not how RuneScape works at all. As I said, in RuneScape you're 3 classes at the same time, in which case you might be asking, okay, fine, you're 3 classes at the same time, I can accept that. Doesn't that mean that there's just a best in slot item for each slot for each of the 3 combat styles? So there's a best mage helmet, a best warrior helmet, and a best range helmet. The answer is no. It depends on the encounter. That gets us to number 3, which is probably the most mind-blowing thing about itemization for me. When I was new to this game, it took me a while to wrap my head around this. Itemization is balanced around encounters, not characters. So it's true that there is a magic staff that has better stats than most other magic weapons, and a melee chest piece that's going to be very useful most of the time you're using the melee attack style, but both of these items have trade-offs that would prevent them from being best in slot in every application. In WoW, every class has a list of best in slot items, but in RuneScape, it's not characters that have best in slot lists, it's encounters. So here's an example of an encounter best in slot table for a boss, the Kraken. So this is a lot of data. You don't need to be able to parse all of the tables that I'm about to share with you. Just get the idea that the best in slot items for the boss are listed all the way on the left side of the table, with less effective alternatives to the right, and that these tables have a huge variety of items on them. So that's the table for the Kraken, but every encounter, whether it's a specific quest, a specific leveling strategy, or a specific boss, they all have different recommended gear. Let's give an example. Say you're fighting a demon boss, and let's say that that boss is weak against melee, but it uses magic attacks against you. In that situation, you want a melee weapon that can deal bonus damage to demons. But you might not want to wear full melee gear because melee gear is weak against magic and the boss attacks you with magic. You also might not want to just wear gear that's fully resistant to magic, both because the boss might attack with other styles and because you would lose out on all of the offensive bonuses from melee gear. So for every fight in the game, the recommended gear varies based on the boss's specific stats and attack patterns, and whether any combat style switches are required in the fight. Here's the best in slot chart for that demon boss I mentioned, Skotizo. Again, I don't expect you to be able to parse any of the charts, other than to just see that there is a huge variety of items on every chart. Many of the items on this chart are going to show up in other fights that require melee, but I wanted to point out a few unusual things on this one. Okay, we'll start with the helmet. The best helmet for this boss is the Slayer helmet. So quickly, the Slayer helmet is a reward from the Slayer's skill, and it gives you a really significant accuracy and damage bonus against enemies that are assigned to you as a Slayer task. Now, Skotizo technically counts as a black demon, which is an enemy type that can be assigned to you while training Slayer. So if you happen to have a black demon Slayer task, then this helmet is best in slot for fighting this boss. The chest and leg slots are also interesting because they include a variety of melee-oriented strength gear and ranged-oriented gear with high magic defense. The best in slot recommendation has you using a chest piece that is typically associated with ranged damage, combined with pants that are more typically expected in a melee fight like this one, because the ranged chest mitigates the magic defense penalty from the melee pants. Now, I've already set up the weapon slot by talking about using a sword that's strong against demons. That sword is called Arclight. Arclight is a very easy weapon to access with minimal prerequisites to use, but it's useless against anything that's not a demon. Now, I want to point out that the highlighted items to the right of Arclight are the most expensive melee items in the entire game. The Scythe of Vitur is an extremely rare drop from the game's most difficult raid. In a normal MMO, it would be the flat-out best-in-slot melee weapon for at least an entire patch cycle, but in OSRS, against this specific boss, it gets beaten out by a dinky quest reward weapon that all players have trivial access to. So it isn't really possible to make a master best-in-slot gear chart that covers the whole game, because every encounter has its own separate chart. This means that eventually you want to get your hands on most of the gear in the game, as you need different gear for different activities. This screenshot is an example of my personal bank. This isn't just collecting things for collection's sake. All of the gear listed here in my bank has a use case in some encounter chart somewhere in the game. But how does Jagex handle strict upgrades to gear? They have to be able to put in an upgrade to an item, otherwise they would never be able to patch the game, right? So that's number 4, reagents and degradation. Recall that Jagex's design philosophy pressures them to avoid adding gear that just invalidates old gear that's already in the game. So as a result, when new content gets added, it often takes the form of a reagent or it's somehow degradable. What does that mean? Okay, let's talk about reagents first. Suppose Jagex is adding new content like a boss or a raid, and they want to have it drop a reward that is a direct upgrade to an existing item in the game. Here are some real examples in old school RuneScape. The items on the right are just strictly better than the items on the left. In a typical MMO, the developer would just go ahead and release the boss or raid and the upgrade, and that would just invalidate the old item. In RuneScape, instead of just having the boss drop an upgrade that's strictly better than an old item, the boss instead drops a reagent. The reagent has to be combined with the old version of the item in order to create the new, more powerful item. And that makes sure that the old item stays relevant, because even if you get a boss to drop a rare reagent, that reagent is useless by itself. You still have to get your hands on the old item to upgrade it. So not only is the old item relevant, but the old content that drops the old item is relevant. So that's how reagents work. Let's talk about degradation. Okay, so many late game items need to be charged with other items, and then they degrade or they lose charges with use. And it's a way for Jagex to add powerful items to the game that are costly to use. Modern MMOs do tend to have gear that degrades and must be repaired, but it's like a flat currency sink that exists for every item in the game. It's not really a design space mechanic to build around. In RuneScape, most items are not degradable, so it's a balance knob that Jagex can turn if they want to add a powerful item to the game. The gear listed here is unusual because it needs to be repaired with coins as it breaks. But items don't necessarily need to be recharged with coins. Other items might be required to be consumed. You might recognize some of these sprites from earlier sections. The sword at the top is Arclight, that Demon Bane weapon that was best in slot against the demon boss. The base sword is trivial for most players to get from a quest reward, but it has to be charged with ancient shards, which are still pretty accessible, but which might make you think twice before just busting out this sword against every demon in the game. The second item is the Abyssal Tentacle, which you might recognize from when we were talking about reagents. The Abyssal Tentacle uses both the reagent and degradation strategies. You have to get a Kraken Tentacle from a boss fight, and that lets you convert an Abyssal Whip into the upgraded Abyssal Tentacle. However, the tentacle degrades after each use, and it has to be recharged with more Abyssal Whips. That makes the content that drops the Abyssal Whip even more relevant because players are constantly destroying whips to maintain this upgrade. The Sanguinesti staff, you might recall from the earlier discussion on trade-offs. I mentioned that this is a really good magic staff, but it has an extremely high upkeep cost, and this is it, Blood Runes. The staff is a rare drop from the most difficult raid in the game, and while it is strictly better than other staves for much of the game's content, the upkeep cost is so high that the player would be silly to use it for all content that requires magic damage. And the Scythe of Vitur below it was the extremely rare, ultra expensive melee raid drop that was outclassed by the Demon Bane sword when we were talking about that demon boss. Like the Sanguinesti staff, it's also charged with expensive blood runes, but also with vials of blood. And since players have to calculate whether the upkeep cost of using an item for a specific encounter is going to cut into their profits, it keeps non-degradable items relevant. If killing a boss provides, say, 100,000 gold per hour, but using the uber powerful staff or scythe costs you 200,000 per hour just to upkeep it, it had better more than double your kill speed, otherwise it's not worth using the staff or scythe, even if it is a strict upgrade. Okay, and our last itemization bullet is side grades, which are possibly the best tool in Jagex's design arsenal. In RuneScape, most equipment in the game is not an upgrade, it's a side grade. Now, I'm using the word side grade here in comparison to the way gear upgrades work in typical MMOs. Let's look back at that upgrade and reagent table from earlier. In a typical MMO, the items on the right would be mandatory for progression at some point. Their impact on your character's average item level and stats would be necessary for you to access content in the patch cycle. Boss fights and enrage timers would be calibrated around the stats from the upgraded items, and some content would be mathematically impossible without the upgrades on the right. In some cases, content is outright gated by eye level. That is, you're not even allowed to queue into a dungeon or raid without having enough of the items on the right to bring your gear level up. That's not how RuneScape works at all. The items on the right are definitely strict upgrades to the items on the left, but because of the way the content is structured, they're not strictly necessary for progression. And that can be tough to understand if you're still modeling RuneScape as an MMO. The first thing that makes these upgrades feel more like side grades is the aforementioned point about each encounter having its own best-in-slot table. There might be a cape or a pair of boots that is very useful or even best in slot for specific applications, but useless in every other scenario. Therefore, if you want to play all of the content in the game, you're encouraged to collect all of these little side grades for their very specific uses. I'll give you an example. At time of recording, Old School RuneScape has 2 raids, and they're both full of encounters that benefit from having 1 or 2 very specific items that have limited utility outside of the raid. People will spend hours farming a difficult boss just to get its rare drop that is a minor upgrade in one possible encounter in one of those 2 raids. In this example, this bludgeon weapon is pretty difficult to get, and for most content it's not amazingly better than much cheaper and more accessible alternatives, but it's nearly best in slot against one boss in the Chambers of Xeric raid, and so people will farm for it to make that one boss slightly smoother. Like I said in the self-direction section, it makes collecting equipment feel more like getting upgrades in a Metroidvania. Imagine a chart like this, but with extra keys and locks for all of the different optional items that drop all throughout the game, which are themselves, of course, gated by skill levels and quest completions. Since each item has a specific use case, it means there is very little degeneracy in RuneScape itemization. In typical MMOs, all you care about is eye level. So even if items have all kinds of little differences like cosmetics, stats, they degenerate to does this increase my eye level, yes or no? And RuneScape doesn't have that issue. Speaking of degeneracy, I talked a bit about Iron Man mode in the single player section and how it can enhance the game's core features. Here, the feeling that you want to collect every item in the game for its niche use cases is also enhanced by playing as an Iron Man. Remember that Iron Men can't trade with other players, and they can't use the game's equivalent of the auction house, and that completely changes how the entire game is played. Trading in World of Warcraft doesn't feel like it causes you to miss out on content because WoW gear is very progress degenerate. It's either an eye level upgrade or it's not, whether you got it from crafting, a rare drop, a raid reward, or the auction house. But being able to trade in RuneScape is like if you were able to just buy upgrades in a Metroidvania. If you could just buy an important progression upgrade like the speed booster with currency, you could just skip the boss or even the entire area that normally gates the speed booster. Similarly, if you can just buy that bludgeon that I mentioned earlier, you could make the Chambers of Xeric raid smoother for yourself without ever having to touch the boss that drops the bludgeon. So I think that about explains RuneScape's itemization, but I mentioned that the whole side grade thing makes more sense when you consider how the game is structured differently from modern MMOs. Each encounter having its own best in slot table is one example of that different structure, but there's another structural topic related to the way items work that deserves its own section. And that's why RuneScape is not an MMO, Part 8, Inventory Management and Healing, or 28 Precious Slots. Alright, I've talked about how gearing and itemization works very differently from modern MMOs, but if there's one core system around which the entire game revolves, RuneScape's system of inventory management might be it. So in most modern MMOs, you have effectively unlimited inventory space. I mean, it's possible to fill up your bags, but it's virtually unheard of to have an encounter in an MMO that is decided based on inventory space. WoW in particular had a habit of just expanding inventory space in every expansion for some time. It's a luxury, it's not really something the developers think about when balancing encounters. At any given time, you might only need 10 free slots to do whatever you want to do in the game, and you might only need to bank every few days. In contrast, RuneScape offers players exactly 28 inventory slots, and very few items stack in the inventory at all. Like I keep saying, if you're mentally modeling RuneScape as like other MMOs, then just hearing, well, it's like other MMOs except you only have 28 as like other MMOs, then just hearing, well, it's like other MMOs except you only have 28 inventory slots, probably sets off a bunch of red flags. But it's not just, it's like MMOs, but it's less convenient. Every aspect of RuneScape is calibrated around these 28 precious slots. Let's look at how. Number 1. Healing. I'm listing this one first because it's the most important. RuneScape is different from other MMOs in many ways, as we've been discussing at length here, but to me, one of the most important ways it differs is its treatment of healing. You may have noticed that in the class and itemization sections earlier, I talked about warriors, rangers, and mages, but at no point did I mention healers. That's because they're not a thing in this game. Healing in RuneScape is, by design, very difficult to come by, and it's tied almost exclusively to inventory management. There are no spells that heal the player directly, at least not in the conventional MMO sense. RuneScape veterans, check the disclaimer at the bottom. Instead, healing almost exclusively comes from food items, which take up your precious inventory slots. That means that, given that there is a maximum amount that food can heal, and a maximum of 28 inventory slots, players have a theoretical maximum amount of damage they can sustain in any encounter. So as an example, say that you have 84 hit points. Take your 84 total hit points and add the combined potential healing from all of the food in your inventory, and with this particular inventory setup, you'd have 700 potential HP for an encounter. Once you run out of your 700 HP by eating all of your food, you're done. You're going to have to leave to restock before you can keep fighting. and that is the RuneScape concept of number 2, trips. Because of the limited healing, you can think about combat encounters as trips in RuneScape, during which the player is attempting to get as many kills and loot rolls as possible before they inevitably run out of healing items and need to retreat to the bank and restock. Since your ability to keep fighting is dependent on inventory space, you can gauge how efficiently you're handling content by how long you're able to prolong a trip before needing to restock on food. This concept of a trip can be confusing if you're modeling RuneScape like an MMO. We have to take a little detour here into the way PvE works in RuneScape to understand the difference. So when you consider how dungeons work in WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, it doesn't make sense to ask how many dungeons can you complete before you run out of supplies. We've already discussed that running out of supplies isn't really a thing in modern MMOs, but beyond that, the structure of PvE content is different too. In a typical MMO, a dungeon is a pretty big time investment, relatively speaking. You're usually on the hook for at least 30 minutes of your time. Now, RuneScape does have content that requires a 30+ minute time investment, namely the game's 2 raids, but most other endgame content is significantly shorter. Fighting any one boss in the game often just takes a couple of minutes per kill. From this screenshot, you can see a boss called Zulrah that I've become very comfortable killing. On my 91st kill, I came in at just under 2 minutes for my kill time. In most cases, the game isn't really asking, can you win against this encounter? Even when your gear is very bad, you can probably get at least 1 kill on most bosses. This is a screenshot from my first Zulrah kill, so 90 kills earlier. It took me over 5 minutes and was a harrowing experience. It took 2 hours of practice, dying repeatedly to finally win for the first time, and it left me with barely any supplies remaining. Know that not having supplies remaining is bad, because supplies take time and money to build up, and when you burn through your food and potions, they're just gone forever. So this boss, Zulrah, has some valuable and extremely useful drops, but they're also pretty rare. On average, you're only going to see one of these rare items every 128 kills or so. So taking 5 minutes to barely kill the boss was fun to prove that I could do it just once, but it wasn't worth the time or money investment to keep burning through supplies by farming the boss so slowly. Now, when I came back to the boss later with better gear and experience with the game, I was able to get much faster kills with significantly more supplies remaining, and it became economical to farm. Point is, again, RuneScape is less about can you clear the content at least once, it's about how long does each kill take. How many kills can you get per trip before you run out of supplies and have to leave? How many supplies did you burn compared to the value of the drops that you got? In other words, the game is more focused on efficiency, similar to a looter action RPG like Diablo. In Diablo 3, the question usually isn't, will I finish this Greater Rift eventually? It's, how efficiently can I finish this Greater Rift? How much time can be remaining? Quick aside about difficulty, when you hear that RuneScape might expect you to farm a 2-minute boss 100+ times, you might think, yikes, that sounds boring? I think that presupposes that each 2-minute kill is easy or uninteractive. So RuneScape doesn't have an action bar. All actions are mediated through mouse clicks, and that might sound like that must mean there's no difficult content in RuneScape, but it can be extremely mechanically difficult, as hard or harder than what you'll see in other MMOs. The skill cap is extremely high, and the difference between an ultra-skilled player and a typical player like me is night and day. All right, that concludes the PvE detour. Thank you. To summarize, you can think of PvE encounters in terms of trips, in which you try to get as many kills as possible before you run out of supplies and leave to restock. The trip structure is why in the previous section I said that these upgrades are more like side grades when compared to typical MMOs. At best, they save a few seconds off of each of your kill times. The extra DPS or damage mitigation saves you a couple pieces of food per kill. They make you slightly more efficient at only those extremely specific encounters for which they are effective. So you want these items, they're better than what you currently have for certain encounters, but you rarely need them to progress. They just make things a little bit smoother. And sometimes you have to ask, is it worth the time to farm for this side grade? Is it going to take me more time to get the drop than the time savings I'm going to get from making the encounter smoother? Cool. Okay, let's go back to talking about the way the inventory itself works. Number 3, opportunity cost. Because each of your precious inventory slots can be thought of as being potential max HP for a trip, choosing to bring an item that is not food is explicitly reducing your potential max health. You could bring a potion that temporarily buffs your damage, but you're paying for it in health. This has so many implications for encounter design. For example, let's take that boss I was just talking about, Zulrah. Zulrah is a very difficult boss that requires you to use multiple attack styles against it. It changes colors throughout the fight, which changes its weaknesses. That means you have to bring multiple gear switches for each style. As you can see, bringing 4 mage items to swap to brings our potential HP down. Because if you end up bringing 4 pieces of mage gear, that is 4 pieces of food you're not bringing. It creates a really dynamic encounter calculus for the player. If you're struggling with even completing 1 kill at a difficult encounter, you can try to find a way to still be successful with only 3 or even 2 pieces of magic gear for your switch, which will let you bring more food and increase your potential max HP. But if you're doing really well at avoiding damage, maybe you sacrifice even more food to bring more gear for your switch, increasing the magic damage you're doing and getting faster, more efficient kills. Even beyond what you bring to an encounter, inventory space has to be considered when determining what you take from an encounter, because bosses drop loot, and if your bag is full of food, you might have to throw some out to make room for drops. This opportunity cost means RuneScape has great risk-reward gameplay. Do I play it safe and bring an extra food item? Do I have enough supplies remaining to squeeze out 1 more kill before I leave to bank? Since each slot represents potential HP, gaining or losing just 1 slot can make a huge difference. Alright, and number 4, beyond combat. I've tried to emphasize that RuneScape isn't particularly focused on combat. Every skill is critical to the core loop of the game, and the inventory management system is the keystone of nearly every skill training loop. Mining is all about filling your inventory with 28 ores, and then deciding whether to bank them to use in smithing later, or drop them on the ground so that you can mine faster. Smithing involves balancing the ratios of coal and ore in your inventory. When you're fishing, when your inventory fills up with fish, it can be efficient to cook it right away if there's a nearby campfire, to avoid having to make multiple trips to catch the fish, bank it, take it from the bank, and cook it later. This limited inventory is one of the many design space balance knobs that Jagex can turn when they're tuning content in the game, and we're going to talk way more about those knobs in an upcoming section. And having 28 inventory slots seems like it's an arbitrary number, and it totally is. I don't think the Gower brothers predicted some perfect divine number back in 2001 when they made this game, but old school RuneScape's developers have respected the number, and now virtually all of the game's content is calibrated around it. If you're accustomed to other online games, it can take a while to get used to, but this tiny and arbitrary difference changes the entire game feel from the ground up. So in addition to every inventory slot representing potential HP, they can also represent potential XP, and that gets us to the final part of why RuneScape is not an MMO, Part 9, XP, or XP is everything and everything is XP. In a typical MMO, you gain XP from killing enemies, completing quests, doing events, and clearing dungeons. Modern games have moved away from placing all of the XP on enemy kills. Instead, you get a small amount of XP for each enemy, and a big boost of XP at the end of the activity. This is another one of WoW's big innovations along the lines of what we covered in the quest design section. It feels good to package XP into a big quest turn-in or dungeon reward, as opposed to drip feeding it from the mobs or the tasks within a quest. Getting XP at the end of an activity feels kind of like opening a present, so it's no wonder that this model has been popular in modern MMO design. In contrast, though, RuneScape's XP system is extremely granular. XP is gained for each individual action. Even in combat, you don't get XP for killing enemies, you get XP for hitting enemies, and the XP you gain is directly proportional to the damage dealt. So in this example, hitting an enemy with a melee weapon grants you attack XP equal to your damage dealt times 4, and hit points XP equal to your damage dealt times 1.5. If your attack misses, or if you hit for 0 damage, you gain 0 XP. This means that doing something like increasing your accuracy or the maximum amount of damage you can roll with each hit directly increases the amount of XP that you're getting. Now, having better DPS in a typical MMO also effectively increases your XP per hour, but since XP is tied up in activity bonuses like quest and dungeon completion rewards, the relationship between DPS and XP gain is much less direct. This actions generate XP system applies to all of the game's 23 skills, and it means that you can think of almost every consumable item as having a potential XP value. So, for example, to gain ranged XP, you need arrows. Each arrow you fire is worth some amount of potential XP to you, based on how much damage you're able to do with that type of arrow on average. As you can see from this example, if you have 8,400 arrows sitting in your bank, and with your ranged gear you can do about 5 damage average per arrow, you can think of those arrows as being worth a potential 169,000 ranged XP. Similarly, to gain magic XP, you have to cast spells, and in RuneScape, all spells use a consumable inventory item called runes. Runes are like arrows for magic spells, and each rune in your bank can be considered to be worth some amount of potential magic XP. If you have like a potion that increases your ranged damage dealt by 20%, you can consider it as giving you 20% more XP per hit. Because of this, there's an XP relationship between virtually every skill and item in the game. And this concept isn't exclusive to RuneScape necessarily. Most modern MMOs have gathering and crafting skills where you can use gathered items to level up crafting. But because RuneScape's 23 skills are all required for account progress, that basic mine for ore, then smith it into bars relationship extends out in a web to touch nearly every skill in the game. So this is a non-comprehensive, complicated network of skill relationships that branch out from the mining skill. Let's dive into it. So like a typical MMO, you can mine for gold ore and then smith that ore into gold bars. This gives you both mining and smithing XP. And you can also craft those gold bars into gold bracelets, which gives you crafting XP. At high mining levels, you can mine for essence, which you can use to make runes with runecraft, which gives you runecraft XP for each essence. You can then use those runes to cast a magic spell that converts the gold bracelets you made earlier into coins, which gives you magic XP for each cast. Now there's a special way to level up mining called the blast mine, where you use dynamite to blow up ore. Making dynamite is complicated, but it involves the mining and woodcutting skills. When you do blast mining, you gain fire making XP in addition to the mining XP when you light the dynamite. At extremely high mining levels, you can mine for amethyst ore. This ore can be chiseled into arrow or bolt tips with very high crafting levels, which gives you crafting XP. And if you have a very high fletching level, you can gain fletching XP by combining the bolt tips with unfinished bolts purchased from the Slayer's skill. You can then use the amethyst bolts to train the range skill. And whenever you train any combat skill, you automatically also gain hit points XP, and you can set your attack style to also earn defense XP. And these bolts are really good against a particular Slayer enemy, so if you happen to be fighting one on the Slayer task, you're also going to get Slayer XP. So right there, mining amethyst can lead you to gain XP in 6 other skills. And that doesn't even account for mining limestone, chiseling it with crafting to make limestone bricks, which can be used to gain construction XP, or mining volcanic ash to make better compost for gaining farming XP. This complicated network might remind you of the dependency chart from earlier, but in this case, these are all optional ways to level up these skills. A player might level all of the skills here to 99 without ever personally mining for gold ore, making dynamite, gathering volcanic ash, getting amethyst, collecting limestone, or chipping dayalt shards. It's perfectly reasonable for a player to just mine 370,000 chunks of iron ore all the way to 99. The complicated XP relationship between skills gives the player more power to self-direct when they're routing their way through the game. But wait a minute. 8,470 arrows fired, 7,413 spellcasts, 370,000 chunks of iron ore. If you haven't actually played RuneScape before, I can imagine your face at those numbers. If we're going to keep talking about XP, I gotta acknowledge it. I've been talking about how great and different RuneScape is for 2 hours, and I've managed to dodge mentioning the one thing most people know about the game. I've avoided talking about it on purpose, not to deceive you, but because you gotta understand everything else that's great about RuneScape before you can even try to understand the elephant in the room. All right, we're gonna change things up here. Interlude: the elephant in the room and the joy of labor. Hey folks, I'm gonna drop the slides for a bit here because I've got a philosophical rant to go on. The elephant in the room is that RuneScape is a game about grinding. That's probably the one thing you already know about it, just through cultural osmosis. Isn't that grindy game? Yeah, it sure is. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. In fact, I think it's kind of awesome. I've spent the last 2 hours just listing the ways that I think RuneScape is different from other MMOs, but I'm going to pivot a bit here and argue the opposite, that when it comes to grinding, RuneScape's not that different, actually, other than the way it packages things. And I know that that's an insane claim, so let me try to back it up here. So what is grinding? It's just doing the same thing over and over and over. And every video game has to have some amount of it. If you've got a short indie game, like a 7-hour single-player game, you can minimize or even get rid of grinding entirely because it's a bounded experience. It's going to end eventually. It's reasonable to show the player something new every couple of minutes or so. But MMOs are designed to be played in perpetuity. You're not supposed to play MMOs for 7 hours. You're supposed to play them for hundreds, if not thousands of hours. And it's physically impossible and unreasonable to ask MMO developers to show you something truly novel every couple minutes of play for 500 hours. It can't happen. So every online game, not even just MMO, but online games like ARPGs, need to involve some amount of grinding, of doing the same repetitive thing over and over and over, right? And I think that what players dislike about that isn't grinding itself. It has more to do with the way grinding is presented. Stealing again from Dan Olson's wonderful WoW Classic video, he talks a lot about difficulty and how that there are many different kinds of difficulty, but we just have one umbrella term for all of them. And that as gamers, we tend to associate the word with a particular kind of difficulty, a test of reflexes or dexterity, right? And that when people were excited for WoW Classic, they were excited to bring a hard game back because they perceive that WoW has gotten easier over time. And in a way, WoW Classic is more difficult than modern WoW, but it's certainly not more difficult from a dexterity or reflexes perspective. The modern game asks you to do some pretty insane things that the classic version of the game just didn't ask you to do. The way that it is more difficult is that WoW Classic is a test of patience, and testing patience is a legitimate form of difficulty. It's about perseverance. It's about determination, right? It's about seeing something through. It gives you the happy brain chemicals when you succeed, and it's a skill that's worth developing. It's the same dopamine that you get from completing a test of patience that you get from completing a test of strength or reflexes or intelligence or what have you. And that grinding is basically that. Grinding is testing patience. And I would say that the value a lot of people get out of the Dark Souls series, Soulsborne games, doesn't have so much to do with tapping R1 and rolling at the right time. It's more about the perseverance aspect. It's about doing something that's difficult, losing over and over, and not throwing your controller, and not shutting the game off, and continuing to try and try and try again until you finally win. And I think that people like that. I think people actually like grinding. I think people like having their patience tested. What they don't like is when the grind is obfuscated in some way, and then that obfuscation layer is lifted. So let's talk a bit about grind obfuscation. RuneScape has a delightful, cute term. It's a euphemism for grinding. Instead of saying grinding, they say training. So if you click rocks for 2 hours to gain mining XP, you're not grinding mining, you're training mining. And I remember laughing at that when I first heard it. I'm like, that's pretty silly. Like, don't they know what this is? But I think they do know what this is, and I think that's why they like to use the word training, because training is really the only thing about RuneScape that's euphemistic. That word, the design itself isn't euphemistic at all. When they say click rocks, they mean click rocks. Modern MMOs like WoW and Final Fantasy XIV don't have a word like training, but the design itself is euphemistic. It's obsessed with obfuscating grinds, with hiding them. Like, they're still there. They have to be there for the reasons we talked about. You can't make a 500 plus hour long game without having you do some repetitive tasks. But if you really just sit and think about like quests, for example, you're talking to different NPCs and they're in different zones, and the quest text they offer you is different. And maybe you're collecting Malboro tentacles or orc noses instead of bear asses. But at the end of the day, you're going from point to point. You're tapping out your skill rotation on whatever mob you're supposed to kill. You're turning in the quest. You're doing the same routine thing over and over and over. And I don't think that this obfuscation process is necessarily a bad thing. People certainly enjoyed it when it first came out, right? Because even though you're still tapping out the same skill rotation over and over, doing the same basic tasks over and over for hundreds of hours, it tricks in your brain a bit into thinking that you're not. That unloading the quest rewards makes you feel like you opened a present, you did a little package. It feels different than sitting in a field and killing boars over and over to hit the level cap, which is what some of us who are older gamers remember. Like, killing boars over and over in a field is a joke in that South Park episode, but that's literally what you did in Final Fantasy XI or in EverQuest or older MMOs, right? So in the gaming culture, we have this deep disdain for grinding. This is especially true in Western gaming culture. I think that if you've been around for a while, you may understand where the disdain comes from. You saw the way games used to be, and you don't want to go back to that, right? It's like the opposite of nostalgia. Please don't make me do what I used to have to do in EverQuest. And that disdain is so steeped into the culture at every corner that even if you're a newer gamer and WoW was your first ever MMO, and that's what's nostalgic for you, that's the old MMO to you, you still, for no particular reason, hate grind. But I say for no particular reason, but I think that there is a reason. I think the reason is that grinding is a kind of labor, and we have really toxic and unhealthy attitudes about labor. Okay, I promised you a philosophical rant, so let's do the philosophical rant. There should be joy in labor. Capitalism has taken labor and it's reduced it to this thing we all have to do to survive. It's made us calculate the opportunity cost of anything we do that's not working for a wage, right? You have to justify why it's worth time mowing your lawn or cleaning your house or tending to your garden or engaging in a hobby you enjoy. And we have to justify the time we spend to friends and family. Worst of all, we have to justify it to ourselves because we could have been spending that time bettering ourselves and earning a wage. The system instills this toxic idea in all of us that labor isn't something that can be done for its own sake, with its own joys. It's something you have to do to survive, and if you finally get a sweet reprieve from labor, you get a chance to relax and unwind and God forbid, play a video game, which already is society condemns as a particularly horrendous waste of time. If you're going to play a video game, why on earth would you play a video game about grinding? Why would you waste your free time laboring? If you look at somebody who's clicking rocks in RuneScape and your first emotional reaction is to feel disgust, I don't think that feeling is wrong. I don't think that it needs to be pointed at RuneScape, but it's a disgust with a bigger problem, a bigger disease in our culture. A lot of people don't have the privilege or the comfort to play RuneScape for 3,000 hours, but it's not that a single mother working 2 jobs doesn't have time to play RuneScape. She doesn't have time to do anything. She can't play a AAA video game. She can't watch prestige television. She can't just veg on the couch and do nothing because forces around her and within her are telling her, what are you doing? You could be working a 3rd job. Better yourself. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's that system, the one that says that some people can be comfortable and others have to suffer. That's what we need to be disgusted with. And for those of us who are privileged and comfortable enough to waste time playing video games, it is so pointless to sit here drafting up these nerd hierarchies about whose waste of time is the least wasteful. Arguing about whether Dark Souls is better than Bejeweled, or if Dungeons and Dragons is more valuable than LARPing, or if World of Warcraft is less wasteful than RuneScape. It's all a waste of time, folks. None of this actually matters. And everyone deserves to be able to waste time however they like. If you're not hurting anybody, why do we care? The problem isn't that I get value from clicking on rocks and you get value from running Mythic Dungeons. I like Mythic Dungeons too, for what it's worth. That shouldn't be threatening to you. That's not the problem here. The problem is the injustice of the fact that there are people that don't get to choose between either at all, that don't get to waste time at all. And when we sit here drafting up these hierarchies and we say, you know, I'm too good for RuneScape, but I'll go ahead and run dungeons in World of Warcraft. We have to ask whose interests are being served by this infighting. Who's being served by the working class fighting over whose waste of time is the least wasteful, right? And I could fill an entire video series just ranting on this topic. Let me just say this: despite all the misery surrounding it, labor can be good. Work can be joyful. There is such a thing as work that's meditative, that's relaxing, that's rewarding. If you've ever been doing a dull or routine task and gotten into like a flow state where time is just flying and you're relaxing, you're feeling good about yourself, that's what grinding can be for a lot of people. It's just the problem is our culture looks at people who enjoy gardening or knitting or building models and we say, okay, you know, it's not work, but at least it's a hobby. At least you're doing something to keep yourself busy. And we look at a video game like RuneScape that has a very similar approach to routine labor as, you know, working in your garden, and we go, ew, are you crazy? That's an obvious, naked waste of your time. You know, we're all gonna die one day. You can't take your money with you. You can't take your garden with you. You can't take your knit sweater or your model ship in a bottle with you. You certainly can't take your World of Warcraft account with you. Even if you willed all of this stuff to somebody else, it's gonna get lost one day to the heat death of the universe. Nothing matters. If you get even a moment of joy from clicking rocks for an hour, why not? Oh, thank God, the slides are back. Okay, we're done talking about comparing to MMOs. Let's just talk about why RuneScape is awesome. Part 1, design space. Or, why grinding just works in RuneScape. Thanks for entertaining that rant. Getting back on the subject here. Okay, cool. So RuneScape doesn't obfuscate its grinds. My argument is that RuneScape's brand of naked grinding works as a core mechanic that is both fun and rewarding. And for me to explain why it works, we got to talk about how grinding training skills works. So you can break down RuneScape's 23 skills into 4 degenerate training loops. Each skill has multiple options to train it, but these are the most simplified ways to do them. Loop number 1 is click a rock. Now, when I say click a rock, I mean this skill is generally about standing in one spot and repeatedly clicking 1, 2, or maybe 3 nodes. Mining is your trope naming skill. It's literally about clicking rocks. You click an ore node, you get some ore and mining XP, and you repeat. Fishing is a little less intensive. You click on a fishing node and then your character just automatically fishes there until the node dissipates. Thieving actually works exactly like mining, and I remember in my first session finding that kind of hilarious, that the main way to train thieving is to pick people's pockets, and it's the same idea. You click on the guy's pocket over and over as though he were just a walking, talking iron ore node. Woodcutting's more like fishing in that it's set and forget. You click on a tree, you start chopping it, your character continues to chop it until the tree is randomly reduced to a stump. And then there's the combat skills. Now, there's a lot of nuance around this, but the basic idea is the same. A simple way to train any combat stat is to click on an enemy, say a goblin, and your character will just auto-attack it until it dies. You'll gain combat XP every time you do damage. That makes it more like fishing or woodcutting than like mining, since you don't have to click constantly, but in its most basic form, combat is basically clicking rocks. So those are the rock clicking skills. Let's look at loop number 2, process items in your inventory. I'm not going to dive into each one of these skills because they're all pretty similar, but the basic idea is that you gain XP by processing other items. For example, mixing potions grants herblore XP. Many of these skills let you bank stand or just stand at a bank full of the materials you need and just keep withdrawing them to process back to back. Other skills might require you to do your processing at a specific location, like smithing requires a forge or an anvil. So since you need to move back and forth between a bank and a processing node like an anvil, those skills blur a little bit into the next category of lap running skills. So for these skills, you have a set of different single-click rocks along a looping path, and you click the rocks along the route. Agility is the main lap running skill since it's literally about that. A common way to train agility is to run a rooftop course where you climb on a roof and then you click on preset agility nodes along the roof to complete laps. Runecraft is the most hated skill in RuneScape. It's about filling your inventory at a bank with blank essences and then running to a distant runecrafting altar where you process the essence into runes with a single click. I would call runecraft more of a lap running skill than an item processing skill because the essence used is trivial to obtain and the distance covered by the lap is typically very large. Farming is arguably a lap running skill in that there are only so many farming patches in the game world, so training farming involves running and teleporting around the game world to plant and harvest crops. And then Hunter has a lot of varied training methods, but many of them are similar to agility, a small set of clickable nodes that you rotate through in a lap. So all 23 skills can be trained by one of these 3 degenerate categories. RuneScape introduces a ton of variety through the 4th, less degenerate category, number 4, minigames. So the word minigame can mean a lot of things in old school RuneScape, from a group boss fight to an ore smelting machine to an obstacle course to an escort mission. These minigames come off as more complex at first, but they all still degenerate to the same basic building blocks. And like the other 3 loops, you're still going to be repeating minigames dozens or hundreds of times to train the other skills. So in this new section that we're in, why RuneScape is awesome, I said I wanted to pivot more to what is cool about RuneScape rather than continuing to focus on comparing it to MMOs, but I'm probably still going to bring up WoW and Final Fantasy XIV a bit as it's helpful to have a reference point. For example, these 4 degenerate training loops are pretty similar to the way WoW and Final Fantasy XIV handle quests. Right, so here's the WoW quest log. It looks pretty complicated on first blush, there's a lot of things going on here, but if you dig into what each quest is actually asking you to do, this is what each of them degenerates to. Remember, degeneracy is talking about the way the quests are reducible from a specific angle. Obviously, each of these quests takes place in different areas with different NPCs and different dialogue, but if we're looking at them from the angle of what is the player actually being asked to do, they are degenerate in that way. And I think I'd break WoW and Final Fantasy XIV quests into 4 degenerate categories as well. Number 1, talk to or deliver an item to an NPC. Number 2, kill X enemies, and I would say that collect X drops from enemies might seem different, but ultimately it degenerates to that. Number 3, collect X items from gathering nodes, and number 4, complete a minigame from a preset list of minigames available in that expansion. And as with RuneScape, the minigame catch-all category is covering a lot of different kinds of less degenerate gameplay. Minigames in modern MMOs have unique rules. In Final Fantasy XIV, you might have a first-person pixel hunt minigame. Flavor-wise, the quest might describe this activity as doing surveillance for an NPC or firing a blow dart, but the mechanical concept is the same. Search the screen, click on a pixel. Back in Pandaria, WoW stretched the capabilities of the engine to add this cool kart racing style minigame. And WoW and FF14 aim to have their minigames break up the monotony of the first 3 tasks a bit, but they're still intended to be about as difficult and take about as much time as those first 3 tasks. My point here is that these minigames are still grindy. They're not that complicated compared to the other 3 tasks, and you're expected to do them dozens or hundreds of times across an expansion. Okay, back to RuneScape. So each of the skills breaks down to a few really simple tasks. Doesn't that get boring quickly? No, actually. Each skill has many different training methods. So optional training methods probably map the most closely to optional progression paths in a typical MMO. In WoW, to progress, I could either grind mobs, do quests, run dungeons over and over, that sort of a thing. In RuneScape, I have a set of options like that for every skill. So looking back at mining again, remember, for its most basic loop, mining is just clicking rocks. I could manually mine ore nodes for XP and ore. Or I could go to the Motherlode Mine minigame, where I mine for pay dirt instead of ore, and then I sift through it for ore fragments. If I wanted more risk, I could participate in the Volcanic Mine Dangerous minigame, where I have to create paths over lava to mine a boulder before a volcano explodes. If I want a challenge, I could fight Zolcano, which is a group skilling boss that you fight by mining it. It also involves smithing and runecraft. Or I could try blast mining, where instead of clicking on ore nodes, I plant and light dynamite in walls and get clear of the explosion before sifting through the blasted ore. That doesn't even cover all of the options for training mining, but it should give you an idea of some of the options each of the skills has to level up. Clicking rocks is obviously the most simple and straightforward choice, but because of the features of the other activities, you might want to do them instead. Motherlode Mine is chill but slow. Volcanic Mine is fast but dangerous. Zolcano has great loot, but it's a challenging and attentive boss fight. And Blast Mine gets you early access to ore, but it's way more complicated than just clicking on rocks. So, isn't one of these just the best or the meta method to train mining? Why don't all of these just degenerate to the one with the best XP per hour? So, if you've never run into the term before, design space is about the group of variables that developers can adjust in a game to make things more interesting or challenging or to give the player more choices. Adding more interesting variables allows developers to break the degeneracy of their systems. So consider a simple card game like Hearthstone. The design space for Hearthstone includes all of the variables you could tweak on a card. The mana cost, attack, and health are all adjustable, as is the card text where most of the design space rests. And for some cards, the name of the card also matters as a variable. But imagine an even simpler version of Hearthstone with no mana cost or card text. If the entire game comes down to just attack and health, it degenerates really quickly to a rather boring system of playing the cards with the highest attack and health. So we have all these variables on the card. I find it really helpful to think of these values as adjustable knobs. In a well-designed game, if you adjust one of the knobs, say if you increase the attack on a card, you have to adjust the other knobs to compensate. Having lots of design knobs can make things complicated and hard for players to understand, but having too few can make things too simple, solvable, degenerate. So as an example, WoW's newest expansion, Shadowlands, is running into an issue. You can pick any expansion to level through, but one expansion, Warlords of Draenor, gets you to the level cap twice as fast as the slowest expansion. And there aren't really any other design space knobs to turn for the expansions. The only knob is time to complete. It's sort of like our extra simplified Hearthstone example, where cards only have attack and health. In Shadowlands, the different expansions don't offer different kinds of gear, so that's not a knob that Blizzard can turn. You're not going to get better gear for taking the longer route. And they're all about the same difficulty level, so there's nothing to adjust there. It's not like the shortest route is also the most challenging. So because there's only the one balance knob, time to level cap, the only reason to do an expansion other than the fastest one would be for its own sake, to see the different stories and content. So in RuneScape, Jagex has a ton of design space knobs to turn to balance the different kinds of training. Because of their design philosophy around the game, they're very careful with these knobs to avoid making any new training methods strictly better than the other methods. Part of not deprecating content means avoiding making content completely degenerate. So let's talk about RuneScape's balance knobs. Design knob number 1. How much XP per hour does this training method award? All 23 skills require the same amount of total XP to go from level 1 to level 99, but all skills and training methods are not created equal. Some skills can get more than 1 million XP per hour, while other slower skills top out around 25k per hour. Now, the different skills don't need to be balanced against each other. It's okay that Slayer is way slower than Cooking, but within a single skill, Jagex tries to avoid adding new training methods that offer strictly better XP per hour without also adjusting some of the other knobs. So knob number 2 is, what are the prerequisites for the training method? It's generally okay for all of the other knobs to be turned up a bit if a training method has a lot of prerequisites. Remember, because of all of the quests in RuneScape requiring you to level all of the skills in the game, what might appear to be a simple prerequisite like must have completed the Song of the Elves quest is actually extremely complex. So here are the quest and skill prerequisites for Song of the Elves. Based on the time needed to do all of this, that one simple requirement might as well say must have played the game for 600 plus hours. We're going to dive into this specific example because I think it reveals a lot about Jagex's design philosophy. Even in these extreme scenarios, Jagex still errs on the side of caution. Song of the Elves is a new, very difficult quest added in 2019. The area it unlocks offers a lot of new training options, and to give you an idea of how conservative Jagex is, one benefit for completing Song of the Elves is a new anvil that is exactly one tile closer to a bank than the previous best anvil in the game. The new anvil requires 600 plus hours of skill training and questing and an extremely difficult quest to access, and the old anvil has no prerequisites at all for one tile. And I think that just goes to show how careful Jagex is when they add strictly better content to the game. Right, knob number 3. Does the training method produce a resource other than XP? Most skills produce something. Fishing gets you raw fish, mining gets you ore, thieving gets you money, cooking gives you cooked food, fletching gets you arrows, herblore gives you potions. Depending on what you're fighting, combat produces the enemy's drops. So you can use this to justify tweaks to the other knobs. If you add a new fishing minigame that doesn't actually give the player any fish, but only gives them fishing XP, it might be justified for that method to get a higher fishing XP per hour. Design knob number 4, how much does inventory space matter? How often do you have to bank? As we discussed, there are only 28 inventory slots in this game, and most items don't stack. So for many training methods, the availability of banking might make a huge difference. If there's an anvil right next to a bank, inventory space matters quite a bit less than for training methods that require you to constantly teleport back and forth between locations and run a long distance to bank items needed for skill training. One way Jagex can adjust this knob is to add special training methods that give a stackable version of a normally unstackable item, but the other knobs need to be adjusted to compensate. Design knob number 5, does the training method cost anything? Some training methods cost a resource to access. For example, you have to deposit gold into a coffer to access the blast furnace, which is a minigame that greatly simplifies smithing training. Or the training method might require a lot of running around, requiring stamina potions to keep your run energy up. It's fair for a method to give extra XP or other rewards if it's costly to do. Knob number 6. Is the training method dangerous? Some training methods are either near dangerous enemies or are part of a dangerous minigame that can lead to taking damage and dying. Now, you don't lose XP when you die, but dying causes you to drop your items, and reclaiming them often costs some kind of fee. Adding a consequence like this can justify turning up the other knobs. And before we move on from danger, I'd like to take a quick detour to a relevant region of RuneScape, the wilderness. Okay, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on the wilderness. It's a controversial topic. It's hard to present a balanced and nuanced take on it. The existence of PvP is pretty important to old school RuneScape. It's one of the reasons why they rebooted the game. It's personally not my bag. I am a PvE guy through and through, but I feel like it's important to note because its design is unusual and it has some really interesting implications. So, quickly, the wilderness is an area in RuneScape in which PvP is permanently enabled. It's not an arena like you'd see in a typical MMO where the sole purpose is PvP. That does exist elsewhere. But the wilderness is also not just about PvP. In fact, it is full of PvE activities, many of which are very profitable either from an XP per hour perspective, resource per hour perspective, or both. There are PvE bosses in the wilderness that drop unique gear that can only be accessed there, and there are many more enticing PvE activities that I haven't even included on this map. Now, when you die in the wilderness, you keep a handful of your most valuable items, but everything else drops on the ground for the person who killed you to loot. So if you bring anything more than a few valuable items to the wilderness, you're risking that a PvP player might find you, kill you, and literally steal it. I know, as a PvE player, tell me that I need to risk getting PK'd to do things, and I don't want to play your game at all. But this looks more dramatic than it actually is in practice. There are a lot of ways to manage your wilderness risk, for example, by only visiting the wilderness naked, thereby not risking any valuable items, and with the way the game servers are distributed, it's not that difficult to avoid enemy players. The fun part, though, is that many of the wilderness skill training methods are specifically designed around this risk component. It's accomplished in a lot of ways, but one way is by offering the unusual ability to stack items gained in the wilderness, where outside the wilderness they would not stack and you would have to bank constantly. That means that you can stay at the same activity without having to leave to bank for a long time. That can lead to outstanding XP per hour training methods. So in this screenshot, I'm getting almost 5 times as much XP per hour as I would be getting outside the wilderness. But the longer you stay, the more the risk is constantly growing that a player is just going to show up and kill you and take all of your hard-earned stacked resources. And that's exactly what happened to me in this screenshot. I got greedy, I stayed too long, and I lost everything in this inventory. Now, PKers can't take your XP away. You can't completely waste time as a result of getting PK'd, but you can get punished for risking too much. Like I said, I want to avoid an entire section on the wilderness because as a PvE-only player, I don't want to raise the ire of the section of the community that's into PvP. Just suffice to say that the handling is very different from most other MMOs and that PvP isn't strictly opt-in. It's more of a predator-prey relationship, unlike anything I've seen in other games. It's made for some very exciting and very frustrating moments in my playthrough of RuneScape. In this screenshot, I lost all of the rare bones in my inventory to a PKer because I was using a risky wilderness-only method to train prayer. If this sort of risk isn't your bag, know that you can avoid the wilderness for the most part. Very, very few quests ever require you to go there, and when you do need to go, you can minimize or totally eliminate your risk. But it's definitely one of Jagex's more interesting design space knobs. Okay, design knob number 7. How complex is the training method? So this knob blurs a bit into the last big one that I'm building up to, but it's worth mentioning. In general, if Jagex makes a training method more complicated, it's okay to adjust the other knobs up a little bit. For example, the blast mine that I mentioned earlier is significantly more complicated than just clicking on rocks to get ore. You don't just click the rocks, you chisel cavities in a wall, load dynamite into the wall, light the dynamite, and then run away before it explodes and damages you. Then you quickly collect the blasted ore, bring it to an ore sack to wash it, and sift for real usable ore. And because the blast mine is so complicated, it justifies cranking up some of the other knobs to compensate. So these 7 knobs can be applied to almost every activity in the game. For a player, the ideal training method would be one that gives great XP per hour, has no prerequisites, produces a ton of resources that stack so you don't need to use a bank, costs you nothing, is completely risk-free, and extremely simple to execute. I say ideal for the player, but realistically the game would be incredibly boring if Jagex ever allowed a training method to work this way. It would be like the boring, simplified version of Hearthstone where the cards only have an attack and health value and no other knobs to turn. Without all these variables, people would just go for whatever method gave the best XP per hour and call it a day. So you've probably noticed that I've only labeled 7 of 8 knobs here. That's because the last design knob is so important, it deserves its own section. It's RuneScape's greatest strength. You might remember it from the thesis hours ago, and it's been on the pin list since the beginning. It's Why RuneScape is Awesome, Part 2, Attention Calibration. Or, the best part of RuneScape is not playing RuneScape. I love RuneScape's attention aspect. It's one of the main reasons I love this game, and why back like 3 hours ago I compared RuneScape more to Cookie Clicker than to World of Warcraft. Attention is the last design space knob Jagex can tweak
There's
when
too
designing
much going
content,
on here.
and I have never seen another developer focus on it in this way. To be honest, I'm not even sure you can say that Jagex